9 ancient clay tablets, pulled from the sands of southern Iraq, translated in secret by a team of scholars who were never named in any academic journal. 9 tablets that described things so far outside the accepted timeline of human history that the institutions funding the excavation chose silence over publication. The tablets were cataloged, photographed, and then, according to 3 independent sources who worked adjacent to the project, destroyed. What did they say? That question has lived underground for decades, passed between researchers and private correspondence, whispered at the fringes of archaeological conferences, buried in footnotes that most people never reach. Tonight, we're going to dig into all of it. Not the sanitized version, the full account, tablet by tablet, line by line. Before we get into what was written on these tablets, you need to understand something about how Mesopotamian archaeology actually works, because it's not what they teach you in school. The region once called Sumer, the flat alluvial plain between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now southern Iraq, produced the oldest known writing system on Earth. Cuneiform, wedge-shaped marks pressed into wet clay, then fired or sun-dried into permanence. We have hundreds of thousands of these tablets in museums and university collections around the world. The British Museum alone holds more than 130,000 cuneiform tablets. Most of them have never been fully translated. Most of them have never been studied at all. That's the first thing they don't tell you. We are sitting on an enormous, largely unread library from humanity's earliest civilization, and the pace at which that library is being translated is painfully slow. Partly because Sumerian is genuinely difficult, partly because funding is always limited, and partly, some researchers argue, because certain things found in that library are inconvenient. Zecharia Sitchin spent decades translating Sumerian and Akkadian texts. His translations were controversial, disputed by mainstream Assyriologists, and his conclusions about the Anunnaki, the beings described in those texts as having come from the heavens, were called fringe at best and pseudoscience at worst. But here is what almost nobody disputes. The texts themselves are real. The clay tablets are real. The descriptions they contain of beings of immense power descending from the sky, of genetic manipulation, of humanity being created to perform labor for these beings, those descriptions are in the tablets. What's being debated is how to interpret them. That debate is important, and we're going to have it tonight. The 9 tablets we're covering are different from the tablets in museum collections. These were reportedly discovered during an excavation in the late 1970s near the ancient city of Eridu, one of the oldest Sumerian cities on record, possibly the oldest city in human history. Eridu sits in what is now southern Iraq, near the modern city of Abu Dhabi. At the time of the excavation, Iraq was under the control of Saddam Hussein's Ba'ath Party, and foreign archaeological teams worked under restrictions that would be considered extreme by modern standards. Access to findings was controlled. Removal of artifacts required government approval that was often not given. Photographs and documentation had to be submitted to Iraqi cultural authorities before they could be shared internationally. The excavation team that found these tablets was working under a joint permit, a consortium involving a German university, a British institution, and American private funding. The exact names of the institutions are disputed in the sources we reviewed, and we're going to tell you why that matters as we go. What multiple sources agree on is the timeline. Tablets discovered in the summer of 1978, translated by autumn of 1979, documentation submitted to Iraqi authorities, and then, somewhere in the bureaucratic chain between Baghdad and the Western universities involved, the tablets disappeared. The physical tablets were either retained by Iraqi authorities, as some accounts claim, or destroyed, as others insist. The translation documents that left Iraq were, according to the researchers who later spoke about this, subsequently buried in institutional archives and, in at least one case, actively suppressed. We're going to go through each tablet one by one. What was reportedly written, what it means in context, and why it would be considered threatening enough to suppress. The first tablet, the smallest of the 9 at approximately 20 centimeters wide and 30 centimeters tall, was identified by researchers as belonging to a pre-dynastic scribal tradition. That's significant. Pre-dynastic Sumer, before the establishment of the first royal dynasties around 2900 BCE, is a period we know very little about. Most of what we have from that era are administrative records. Lists of grain, cattle counts, property transfers. The kind of mundane bookkeeping that represents the earliest uses of writing. This tablet was not that. The language of the first tablet, according to the translation accounts that circulated among researchers in the 1980s, was archaic, even for its probable period of composition. The scribes who created it were working in a register that suggests they were recording something they considered ancient even at the time of writing. Think of it like finding a medieval manuscript that opens with the phrase, "in the time before memory." The author is already telling you that what follows predates their own civilization. The tablet opened with a phrase that translators rendered as something close to, "when the great ones came down from the heavens and touched the Black Land." The Black Land, in the context of Mesopotamian texts, typically refers to the fertile alluvial soil between the rivers. It's a geographical marker. The Great Ones, however, is a translation of a term that corresponds closely to what appears throughout Sumerian literature as the Anunnaki. The word Anunnaki, in its most direct translation, means something like those of royal blood or princely offspring. In the canonical Sumerian texts we already have, the Anunnaki are described as a council of high gods. They judge, they decree, they assign fates. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest known work of literary fiction, the Anunnaki are invoked in the context of cosmic decisions about human mortality. In the Atrahasis epic, which predates and clearly influenced the later biblical flood narrative, the Anunnaki are the ones who create humanity. The Igigi are the worker gods, and when the Igigi rebel against their labor, the Anunnaki solve the problem by creating a new being, the Lulu, the primitive worker. A creature that will do the work the gods no longer want to do. This is established, translated, publicly available Sumerian text. It is not fringe, it is not speculation. It is in the tablets that sit in the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania Museum right now. The first of the 9 suppressed tablets reportedly described what the canonical texts only gesture toward, the actual arrival. Not the consequences of the arrival, not the aftermath, but the event itself, described with a specificity that the main corpus of Sumerian literature never provides. According to the translation accounts, the tablet described the Great Ones arriving in objects that were like the sun at midday, but that moved against the wind. Craft that could land and take off again. The tablet used a term that translators struggled with, a compound word that appeared to combine the Sumerian root for heaven or sky with a word for house or dwelling place, sky dwelling. Or perhaps more accurately, a thing that dwells in the sky and can come to earth. The tablet then described the location of the first landing, not in Mesopotamia. The text appeared to describe a location far to the east, across great mountains. Researchers who analyzed the directional language in the tablet suggested the description might correspond geographically to somewhere in the Indian subcontinent, though they were careful to note how imprecise ancient geographical descriptions tend to be. What the tablet seemed to say clearly was that the first arrival on Earth did not happen in Sumer. Sumer was where they came later, a secondary settlement. This is where things get complicated in ways that mainstream archaeology has not adequately addressed. The oldest known civilization on Earth is Sumer, in the Mesopotamian river valley. But directly to the east, in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, there existed the Indus Valley Civilization, also called the Harappan Civilization. It flourished from approximately 3,300 BCE to 1,300 BCE. At its peak, it covered an area larger than ancient Egypt. It had sophisticated urban planning, standardized weights and measures, a plumbing and drainage system that would not be equaled in Europe for another 3,000 years. And its writing system has never been deciphered. After more than a century of trying, the Indus script remains completely unreadable. We do not know what the people of the Indus Valley Civilization said about themselves. We do not know their myths, their religion, or their history as they understood it. That gap in human knowledge is enormous, and it has never received the cultural attention it deserves. The first tablet reportedly pointed east, toward the gap. The description on the tablet continued. The Great Ones, upon landing in this eastern location, began a process the text described as knowing the earth, a survey. They tested the soil, the air, the water. They measured the depth of the rivers. They cataloged what grew and what moved across the land. The tablet described this process in terms that any modern geologist or biologist would recognize as a resource survey. They were inventorying the planet. One detail in the first tablet that generated significant discussion among the researchers who later spoke about these findings. The text described the Great Ones as experiencing physical difficulty on arrival. Not illness exactly, but a period of adjustment. The tablet used language suggesting that the environment of Earth was not natural for them. The gravity, one researcher suggested, based on the physical descriptions in the text. The pressure, the composition of the atmosphere, whatever world they came from, Earth was different in ways the body noticed. That detail is either a remarkable coincidence or a piece of information that a Bronze Age scribe could not have invented, because it is precisely what actual planetary scientists describe when they model what a human body would experience arriving from a planet with different surface gravity. Your cardiovascular system works differently. Your musculature, adapted to a different gravitational pull, has to readjust. Your sinuses respond to changes in atmospheric pressure. The adjustment period is real, and it is physiological. A Bronze Age scribe had no reason to invent that detail. It serves no religious or mythological purpose. It doesn't make the gods more impressive. If anything, it makes them seem mortal, vulnerable. That's an odd choice for a civilization that worshipped these beings. Unless the scribe wasn't inventing it. Unless the scribe was recording something that actually happened. The first tablet reportedly ended with a phrase that translators rendered as, "And they looked upon the earth and found it sufficient." Not beautiful, not sacred, sufficient. The word choice in the original, according to researchers who discussed the translation, suggested an assessment, a verdict, the kind of language you use when you've run your tests and the results are acceptable. The earth passed inspection, and so they stayed. The second tablet was reportedly the most scientifically startling of the 9, and also the most contested in terms of translation accuracy. It described, in detail, that researchers found almost impossible to process through the lens of ancient mythology, a process of biological modification. To understand why this is so significant, you need a moment of context about what we already know from mainstream Sumerian texts. The Atrahasis epic, one of the most complete and well-preserved Mesopotamian texts we have, describes the creation of humanity in explicit detail. The gods, led by a figure named Enki, who is the god of wisdom, fresh water, and creation, mix the blood of a slain god with clay to create the first human. The text is often interpreted metaphorically, as creation myths typically are. Clay is earth. Blood is divine essence. The standard mythological template. But Zechariah Sitchin and others pointed out something that mainstream scholars largely ignored. The operational language in the Atrahasis epic is not metaphorical in structure. It reads procedurally. There are steps. There is a described process. There are errors and corrections. There is a trial run that fails before the successful version. It reads, these researchers argued, less like mythology and more like a record of a technical procedure. The second of the 9 suppressed tablets reportedly took this procedural quality and amplified it to a degree that left researchers shaken. The tablet described what appears to be a biological laboratory. The Sumerian term used, according to translation accounts, was something that combined words for pure, or clean, with words for house and knowing, a clean house of knowing, a sterile facility of knowledge. The language suggests contamination control, aseptic conditions, the kind of environment where biological work is done without interference from outside microbes. Inside this facility, the text described a process of taking living material from the Great Ones themselves, specifically a substance described as the inner seed that carries the form, and combining it with material taken from an existing creature on Earth. The existing creature was not described clearly enough for researchers to identify it with certainty, but the physical description suggested a primate. Upright posture, manual dexterity, capable of using simple tools. The text said this creature already existed on Earth and was close, but not complete. Close to what? The tablet made clear. Close to the Great Ones themselves. This is where the tablet departed completely from anything in the established Sumerian canon, and into territory that mainstream archaeology has absolutely no framework for. The tablet described a series of attempts to combine the genetic material of the Great Ones with the genetic material of this existing primate species. The first attempts, the text says, produced creatures that were broken in form, not viable. The tablet described them as short-lived, as misformed, as unable to sustain themselves. There were multiple failed iterations. The text enumerated them. Researchers who reviewed the translation noted that this language bore a striking resemblance to the kind of documentation a modern geneticist would produce when running a series of failed gene splicing experiments. The specificity was the thing that unnerved them. Ancient creation myths don't typically include failed drafts. They don't include trial and error. The gods create, and it works. That's how mythology functions. The power of the creator is demonstrated by the perfection of the creation. This tablet described imperfect, failed creations. It described a process of refinement, of learning what didn't work in order to arrive at what did. The successful iteration, the tablet reported, produced a being that was able to understand the word and hold the tool and carry the burden, understanding language, using tools, performing labor. And the text was explicit that this was the purpose: labor. Not worship, not companionship, not love. The new creature was made to work, so that the great ones would not have to. Here is where this intersects with something that modern genetics has produced, and the intersection is uncomfortable enough that most scientists don't discuss it publicly. Humans share approximately 98.8% of their DNA with chimpanzees. That gap of 1.2% is what makes us entirely different kinds of beings. But there's another genetic anomaly that's even more interesting. Humans have 46 chromosomes. Chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans all have 48. Somewhere in the transition from our common ancestor to modern Homo sapiens, 2 chromosomes fused. Human chromosome 2 is what geneticists call a fusion chromosome. It was formed by the fusion of 2 ancestral chromosomes that still exist separately in other great apes. This fusion is not something that happens naturally without consequence. In living organisms, chromosome number changes are almost always fatal or result in infertility. And yet here we are, with a chromosome count that is different from our closest relatives, the fusion happening at some point in our evolutionary history in a way that somehow produced a viable, fertile species. Scientists have explanations for this. Natural selection, genetic drift, the mathematics of population genetics. These explanations are plausible. But the fusion itself, the physical fact of it, is the kind of anomaly that a reader of the second tablet cannot easily dismiss. The tablet reportedly went further. It described a specific modification made to the new creature that the Great Ones did not include by accident. The text described what translators rendered as the closing of the long sight. The new creature, unlike the Great Ones themselves, was designed with a deliberately limited lifespan. Where the Great Ones appeared to live for extraordinarily long periods, time spans the tablet described in terms that suggested centuries or millennia, the new creature was built to live briefly and then die. The limited lifespan was a feature, not a bug. It was a control mechanism, a being that lives long enough to be useful but not long enough to become dangerous. The tablet also described a second deliberate limitation, one that researchers found even more provocative. It described a restriction on what the text called the inner knowing, a cap on cognitive capacity. The Great Ones, the tablet said, were careful not to make the new creature too much like themselves. The new being had to be capable of following complex instructions, of learning skills, of communicating, but it could not be given the full range of mental capacity that the Great Ones possessed. That would make it, the text said, equal to us, which is not our purpose. Not our purpose. Not the creature's purpose. Our purpose. The new creature was not created to be an equal. It was created to be a worker, and the cognitive cap was engineered to ensure it would remain one. Researchers who discussed this tablet in private correspondence noted that this description mapped uncomfortably well onto something anthropologists have struggled to explain for decades: the Great Leap Forward. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, appear in the fossil record roughly 300,000 years ago. But for most of that time, we show almost no signs of sophisticated behavior. Then, approximately 50,000 years ago, something changes. Cave paintings appear, jewelry appears, long-distance trade networks appear, ritual burial appears. The full suite of behavioral modernity, everything that makes us culturally human, appears in an extraordinarily short window of time. Anthropologists call this the Upper Paleolithic Revolution. They debate its causes endlessly: climate change, population bottleneck, a genetic mutation that rewired the brain, something triggered it. The second tablet reportedly offered a different explanation. The cap was partially lifted, not removed entirely, but reduced. And the result, the text said, was that the new creatures began to do things the Great Ones had not anticipated. They started asking questions. The third tablet shifted from the biological to the architectural, and it described something that, if true, would require a complete revision of the timeline of human civilization. The tablet reportedly contained what appeared to be a city plan, not a symbolic representation of a divine city in the heavens, the kind of idealized celestial architecture you find throughout Mesopotamian religious texts. An actual functional layout, a physical city, with districts, waterways, structures, and an infrastructure that the text described in procedural terms. The city was called, in the translation accounts, by a name that researchers rendered approximately as the first great house of the earth. They noted that this name corresponded phonetically with one interpretation of the Sumerian word for Eridu, the very city near which these tablets were found. Eridu, in Sumerian tradition, was the first city, the city given to humanity by the gods before the flood. In the Sumerian king list, one of the most important documents we have from ancient Mesopotamia, Eridu, is listed as the city where kingship descended from heaven. Kingship descended from heaven. The language is always treated as metaphor. The third tablet apparently described it as literal. The city plan in the tablet included structures that the text described as having walls that were like mountains, not made by human hands. This phrase appears in various forms throughout Mesopotamian literature and is usually interpreted as hyperbole. The walls are very tall. The walls are very impressive. The literary tradition of describing monumental architecture in superhuman terms is ancient and universal. But the third tablet reportedly gave dimensions, specific numbers, the height of the walls in units that researchers attempted to convert to modern measurements, the width of the main channels through which water was directed, the scale of the central structure, the one the tablet appeared to designate as the residence and working place of the Great Ones themselves. When researchers attempted those conversions, the scale of what the tablet described exceeded what Bronze Age human labor could have built with the tools available. Not by a small margin, by a significant one. This puts us on terrain that is genuinely contested but also genuinely fascinating. Because scattered around the ancient world there are constructions that mainstream archaeology has difficulty explaining with existing models of Bronze Age capability. The Giza Plateau in Egypt, the megalithic temples of Malta, among the oldest stone structures on Earth, the platform at Baalbek in Lebanon, where massive stone blocks weighing hundreds of tons were fitted together with a precision that modern engineers struggle to replicate. The underwater structures off the coast of Japan near Yonaguni, whose artificial origin is still debated. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, now believed to be approximately 12,000 years old, built by people who, according to the established timeline, were not yet farmers, not yet settled, and not yet supposed to be capable of organized monumental construction. 12,000 years ago, more than 8,000 years before the pyramids. Göbekli Tepe's massive stone pillars, many of them T-shaped and covered in intricate carved reliefs of animals, were erected at a level of technical and organizational sophistication that forces archaeologists to either revise what they know about prehistoric humans or find another explanation for who built it. The third tablet reportedly described a city that would have been built in this same ancient window, before the established timeline of Sumerian civilization, before writing, before agriculture, according to the conventional sequence. And the tablet described it as having been built not by humans, but for humans, by the Great Ones, as a place of habitation and administration. The Great Ones lived there, worked there, and eventually the text said, gave the city to the humans who served them. One specific detail in the third tablet generated prolonged discussion among researchers. The text described an energy source, not fire, not mechanical work, something that the tablet described using terms that translators struggled with enormously, combining words for deep earth with words for invisible force and turning. A force from the deep earth that turns, that powers, that animates the city's functions. This is the kind of detail that invites accusations of projection, of reading modern technology backward into ancient text, and that accusation is fair. When you describe something with words like invisible turning force from the earth, and someone reads that as geothermal energy or electrical generation, you can legitimately ask whether the reader is finding meaning or imposing it. But consider the alternative explanation. What word would a Bronze Age scribe use to describe something they had no conceptual framework for? They would use the words they had: deep earth, force, turning. The inability to name something precisely is not evidence that the thing doesn't exist. It's evidence that the observer is encountering something outside their vocabulary. The third tablet also described a hierarchy within the city. Different classes of the Great Ones held different functions. Some were described as workers within the city's operations. Others were described as what translators rendered as watchers, beings stationed at the boundaries of the settlement who monitored the surrounding territory. And at the center of the hierarchy was a figure the text described in terms that had counterparts throughout Sumerian religion. A chief figure, an authority, a name that resonated with the Sumerian deity Enlil, Lord of the Wind, head of the Sumerian pantheon, the being who, in canonical texts, decreed the fates of humanity. In canonical Sumerian texts, Enlil is the one who decides to destroy humanity with the flood. He is the one who is kept awake by human noise and who grows impatient with the species he helped create. He is authoritative, sometimes cruel, and deeply ambivalent about the humans he oversees. The third tablet reportedly described this figure not as a god in the religious sense, but as an administrator, a manager of a planetary operation, someone with enormous power who was nevertheless accountable to something or someone beyond the city. The text included a phrase that translators rendered approximately as, "those who give account to the distant ones." The great ones in the city were not the top of the hierarchy. They reported to others who were not on Earth. That chain of command is one of the details that researchers who reviewed the third tablet found most difficult to fit into any conventional mythological framework. Gods don't answer to higher authorities. That's definitionally what makes them gods. The beings in this tablet were something else, something more like a colonial administration, reporting to a home base. We already know about the flood. That's the thing. You think you know about the flood from Genesis, from Noah, from the Christian and Jewish traditions that have shaped Western civilization's understanding of human prehistory. But the flood story is older than Genesis by more than 1,000 years. It's in the Sumerian texts, it's in the Akkadian texts, it's in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and it's in forms so similar to the later biblical account that the parallels cannot be coincidental. In the Atrahasis epic, the Sumerian precursor to the Noah story, there is a man named Atrahasis, which means exceedingly wise. The great god Enki, the creator of humanity, warns Atrahasis in secret that the other gods have decided to destroy humanity with a flood. He instructs Atrahasis to build a vessel, to take the seed of all living things, to survive what is coming. The flood happens. Most of humanity dies. Atrahasis and his vessel survive. The gods, confronted with the silence left by the destruction of the beings who served them, regret what they've done. This story, or variations on it, appears in the mythological traditions of cultures across the world that had no known contact with each other. The Mesoamerican traditions, the Hindu traditions, indigenous North American traditions, the Gilgamesh flood narrative, the Australian Aboriginal flood myths, the Chinese legend of Gunyu and the Great Flood. Researchers have cataloged more than 200 flood myths from cultures on every inhabited continent, and the core structure is remarkably consistent. Divine displeasure, a warning given to a righteous individual, a vessel, the survival of a remnant, a new beginning. The fourth tablet reportedly took the flood narrative into territory that none of the canonical versions touch. The canonical versions tell you that the flood happened. The fourth tablet reportedly told you why, with a specificity that removed any ambiguity about divine motivation. The text, according to translation accounts, described a meeting of the Great Ones, a council. The issue under discussion was the humans. The humans had grown in number beyond what the Great Ones had planned for. The text used a phrase that translators rendered as, "They have spread across the face of the earth beyond our reckoning," which carries unmistakable implications of a population that got out of control. But more than the numbers, the text describes something else that concerned the council. The humans had begun to know things they were not given to know. That phrase, the same theme from the second tablet, the cognitive cap wasn't holding. The Genesis account of this same period says something interesting that is usually treated as metaphorical. The sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. The Nephilim, giants, hybrid beings. The biblical text treats this briefly, almost as an aside, before pivoting to the flood. But in the Enochian texts, in the Dead Sea Scrolls material, in the Book of Jubilees, this hybrid breeding between divine beings and human women is treated as a central transgression. One of the primary reasons for the flood, the mixing of what was supposed to remain separate. The fourth tablet reportedly described this mixing in terms that were biological rather than theological. The Great Ones, some of them, had violated the original protocol. They had bred with the human population. The offspring were not fully human, but were not fully like the Great Ones either. They were, the text said, ungovernable. They had enough of the Great One's cognitive capacity to be dangerous, but none of the discipline that came with the Great One's culture and training. And they were teaching the regular human population. The offspring, the hybrids, were sharing knowledge, practical knowledge, how to work metals, how to read the movement of celestial bodies, how to cultivate specific plants, how to work stone in ways that went far beyond what the Great Ones had sanctioned. In the Book of Enoch, a text that was part of the Jewish scriptural canon before being removed and that was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, there is a list of the specific knowledge that the fallen angels, the Watchers, taught to humanity. Metalworking, cosmetics, enchantments, the cutting of roots, the signs of the sun. The Book of Enoch frames all of this as sin, as transgression, but strip away the moral framework and what you have is a list of technologies. Advanced skills being transmitted from a more knowledgeable group to a less knowledgeable group. The fourth tablet reportedly named specific knowledge categories that were transmitted, and the list included things that humanity, according to the conventional archaeological timeline, was not supposed to have in the period being described. The Council of the Great Ones, the tablet said, debated the options. Some wanted to intervene gradually, to retrain, to restrict, to claw back the knowledge that had been shared. Others argued that it was already too late. The human population was too large, too spread out, and too aware. A gradual intervention would only slow the problem. It would not solve it. The one identified as the chief figure, the Enlil equivalent, made the decision. The text described the decision as arriving with a phrase that translators found chillingly bureaucratic. Let the earth be returned to the state that preceded the error. Return to factory settings. Erase and begin again. The tablet then described the flood itself, and here is where it diverged sharply from the canonical accounts. The Sumerian and biblical versions describe the flood as a natural disaster, either divinely caused or divinely leveraged. 40 days of rain, the breaking up of the fountains of the deep, an overwhelming of natural precipitation. The fourth tablet described the flood differently. The text used language suggesting a deliberate intervention, not rain, something that came from the direction of the heavens. The tablet described what translators rendered as a great force that moved the waters of the deep places up onto the face of the earth. A mechanism, something that caused the sea level to rise catastrophically in a very short time. This is where geology becomes relevant in a way that is rarely acknowledged in these discussions. We know from geological and archaeological evidence that there was a catastrophic rise in sea levels approximately 11,600 years ago at the end of the last ice age. The melting of the great ice sheets that covered much of the northern hemisphere caused sea levels to rise by approximately 120 meters over a period of roughly 2,000 years. That's an average rise that sounds gradual until you realize it was punctuated by rapid events. Moments when the rate of rise accelerated dramatically, potentially raising sea levels by several meters in just a few centuries or even decades. The Black Sea, which is immediately north of the Fertile Crescent, the cradle of Sumerian civilization, was a freshwater lake before this period. The flooding of the Black Sea basin, as the rising Mediterranean broke through the Bosporus and poured into the lake, would have been catastrophic for any population living in or around it. Some researchers believe this specific event is the historical basis for the flood myths of the ancient Near East. But there's also the Younger Dryas, a period of abrupt climate change that began around 12,800 years ago and ended around 11,700 years ago. And in 2018, a research team published a paper in the journal Science Advances, presenting evidence that the Younger Dryas was triggered by a cosmic impact event. A comet or asteroid that either struck the Earth or exploded in the atmosphere, distributing an enormous amount of energy and releasing enough particulate matter to trigger a decade-long impact winter. The evidence includes platinum anomalies in geological layers from this period, shocked quartz, nanodiamonds, and spherules of melted rock that can only be produced at the temperatures generated by cosmic impacts. The evidence is found at sites across 4 continents. A cosmic impact, something from the sky, something that disrupted the Earth's climate, caused catastrophic flooding as glaciers melted suddenly, and may have wiped out a large percentage of the megafauna and human populations of the late Paleolithic period. The fourth tablet reportedly describes something that came from the direction of the heavens and moved the waters. The tablet also reportedly contained a detail that the canonical flood narratives conspicuously lack: a record of what was saved, not just a man in a boat with his family and some animals. The tablet described a systematic preservation effort. Seeds of plants were cataloged and stored. Genetic material from animals was preserved using a technique the text described in terms that researchers found deeply strange. The language combined words for keeping and life force in a context that suggested preservation of biological material in conditions of extreme cold. A genetic seed bank, stored in conditions of extreme cold, maintained against the day when the flood had receded and the surface of the Earth could be repopulated. There are seed banks on Earth right now. The most famous is the Svalbard Global Seed Vault in Norway, carved into the permafrost of an Arctic island. It holds over 1.3 million seed samples from around the world, preserved against the possibility of catastrophic loss. When it was established in 2008, it was described as a new idea, a precaution against agricultural collapse, a kind of insurance for humanity's food supply. The fourth tablet, if the translation accounts are accurate, described the same concept, executed approximately 12,000 years ago, by beings who had clearly thought through the implications of what they were about to do. They caused the flood. They also prepared for it, because some of them, the text implied, intended to come back. The fifth tablet was reportedly the longest of the 9 and the one that required the most interpretive work from the translation team. It appeared to be a catalog, a list of transmissions, of knowledge packages that were deliberately left for humanity to find and use in the period following the flood. This concept, the idea that advanced knowledge was encoded into ancient monuments, mythologies, or texts to be decoded by later generations, appears across many traditions. It's a core idea in the Hermetic and alchemical traditions of medieval Europe. It's implicit in the construction of the pyramids, which encode mathematical constants and astronomical alignments with a precision that seems to exceed decorative or religious purpose. It's explicit in some interpretations of the Vedic texts, the ancient Hindu scriptures, which themselves claim to be records of knowledge given to humanity by divine beings. The fifth tablet reportedly made this concept explicit in a way that none of the others did. It described, item by item, what was left, where it was left, and who it was left for. The first category of knowledge described in the fifth tablet was astronomical. The Great Ones, before the flood, encoded information about the movements of celestial bodies into the physical landscape, megalithic structures, stone alignments, building orientations. The text described the purpose of this encoding as so that those who come after will know where in the great turning they are. The great turning, the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that causes the position of the stars at the spring equinox to shift over a cycle of approximately 25,920 years. The precession of the equinoxes was officially discovered by the Greek astronomer Hipparchus in approximately 127 BCE. But researchers like Graham Hancock and Robert Bauval have argued for decades that the Great Sphinx of Giza, with its orientation toward the position of the constellation Leo at the spring equinox in approximately 10,500 BCE, encodes knowledge of precession that predates the Greek discovery by 10,000 years. Mainstream Egyptology rejects this interpretation, arguing that the Sphinx was built around 2,500 BCE, not 10,500 BCE. The debate continues. The fifth tablet reportedly described the exact kind of encoding that Hancock and Bauval hypothesize, but it described it as a deliberate plan, not an accidental astronomical alignment. The Great Ones, knowing that the survivors of the flood would eventually rebuild civilization, encoded the astronomical framework into structures that would survive for millennia, structures that the future survivors could observe, measure, and use as a calibration for where they were in the cosmic cycle. A clock, built in stone, designed to last for thousands of years. The second category of knowledge in the fifth tablet was medical. The text described a body of information about the human body, about plants that could be used to treat illness, about procedures for repairing physical damage, about the care of wounds and the management of what the text called the invisible attackers that cause sickness. The invisible attackers, pathogens, bacteria and viruses that Bronze Age people knew nothing about, and that wouldn't be formally identified until Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch in the 19th century. And yet here was a Sumerian text apparently describing them with a term that translated as invisible attackers. This category of knowledge, the tablet said, was encoded primarily in the oral traditions of specific lineages, not in stone, in people. In the hereditary knowledge of particular families or tribes who were selected for this purpose and instructed to maintain the information across generations, from parent to child, for as long as it took for humanity to reach a point where it could use what it was being taught. The third category of knowledge in the fifth tablet was what translators found most difficult to categorize. The text described a kind of knowledge that combined what we would now call physics and what we would now call consciousness. It described the relationship between what the text called the organizing force of the universe and the capacity of the mind to perceive and interact with that force. This is not a category of knowledge that modern science has a word for, because modern science doesn't accept the premise. But it has a name in virtually every ancient tradition on Earth. The Hindus call it prana. The Chinese call it qi. The Polynesians call it mana. The ancient Egyptians described it as the ka, the animating force that inhabited the physical body. The Sumerian texts themselves have multiple terms that might relate to this concept, and the fifth tablet reportedly described it as something that could be learned, practiced, and deliberately cultivated, that had practical applications in the physical world. The researchers who reviewed this section of the translation apparently spent a considerable amount of time trying to parse it, because the descriptions were technical in a way that the other categories were not. The text was not poetic, it was not metaphorical in structure. It read like instructions. and the instructions describe specific techniques for training the mind to perceive and influence this organizing force. Modern physics has something that might be relevant here. Quantum mechanics, in its most radical interpretations, raises questions about the relationship between consciousness and physical reality that mainstream science officially brackets as philosophical rather than scientific. The double-slit experiment, in which the act of observation affects the behavior of particles, suggests something about the role of the observer in shaping physical outcomes. The physics is well established. What it means remains genuinely contested. The fifth tablet apparently described that relationship not as a philosophical curiosity, but as a practical technology. The fourth and final category of knowledge described in the fifth tablet was the most sensitive for the researchers who translated it. It concerned what the text called the Great Ones themselves. Specifically, it described techniques for identifying descendants of the mixed lineages, the hybrid offspring of the Great Ones, and the human population. Techniques for detecting what the text called the seed of the Watchers in individuals who might not know their own heritage. This is where the fifth tablet connected directly to a tradition that runs through every major civilization on Earth: the idea of divine bloodlines, sacred lineages, families that carry a connection to the divine that other families do not. In Egypt, the pharaohs were considered divine, literally the sons of the gods. In Mesopotamia, kingship itself was described as having descended from heaven, implying that earthly rulers were connected to the great ones above. In Europe, the divine right of kings rested on the premise that royal blood was inherently different from common blood, closer to God. The aristocratic obsession with lineage, with bloodlines, with hereditary nobility, has ancient roots that the established historical narrative has never fully explained in material terms. The fifth tablet offered a material explanation. The bloodlines were real. The genetic inheritance was real, and the knowledge left behind included techniques for identifying individuals who carried it. Every major religious tradition on Earth contains a version of the same story: a war among divine beings, a conflict within the hierarchy of the gods, a rebellion, a schism, a falling out that ended with one faction cast down, exiled, or destroyed. In Christianity, it's Lucifer, the angel of light, cast out of heaven for the sin of pride, for refusing to accept a subordinate position. In Sumerian mythology, there are constant conflicts among the gods, political and military confrontations between divine factions that parallel the political conflicts of human kingdoms. In Hindu tradition, the Devas and the Asuras, often translated as gods and demons, are engaged in perpetual conflict, and the texts describe their battles in terms that sound startlingly like advanced warfare. In the Norse tradition, the gods of Asgard are opposed by the giants, the older, pre-divine beings of chaos and power. The sixth tablet reportedly described the historical event that these traditions were all, in their different ways, remembering. The translation accounts describe a text structured like a military record or a political history, not myth, not allegory. A sequence of events, with named parties, described outcomes and consequences that the tablet presented as the reason why the Great One's presence on Earth took the form it did in the period following the flood. The conflict, as described in the sixth tablet, began not on Earth, but before the arrival. Among the Great Ones, there existed two primary factions with fundamentally different views about how to manage the Earth project. The first faction, associated in the text with the figure corresponding to Enlil, believed that humanity should be strictly managed. The creation of the worker beings was a practical solution to a labor problem. But it introduced a risk. Any created intelligence, given enough time and the right conditions, might develop beyond its intended parameters. The Enlil faction's position was that strict control, including population management and deliberate cognitive limitation, was essential to maintaining the relationship in a workable form. The second faction, associated with the figure corresponding to Enki, the creator, the god of wisdom, the one who in canonical texts is always on humanity's side, believed differently. The creation of humanity had produced something genuinely unexpected. The new beings had a quality that the Great Ones had not anticipated, something the text described with a term that translators rendered approximately as the impulse toward the unknown, curiosity. Not just the capacity to follow instructions, but the drive to ask questions, to imagine things that didn't exist, to reach beyond what they were given. Enki's faction saw this as a sign that the creation had transcended its original purpose. That humanity was not a tool. It was something new in the universe. And the appropriate response was not control but guidance, not to limit humanity but to cultivate it. This division mapped almost perfectly onto the theological distinction, found across multiple traditions, between a God of law, of order, of hierarchy, and a God of wisdom, of love, of liberation. The distinction between the Yahweh of the early Hebrew texts, who is territorial, jealous, and demanding of strict obedience, and the Gnostic Sophia, or the Christ of the later New Testament, who subverts the legal order in favor of direct relationship. The distinction between the Vedic Indra, king of the gods, enforcer of cosmic law, and the figure of Shiva, the destroyer, who is also the liberator. These are not coincidental parallels. The sixth tablet reportedly explained where they came from. The conflict escalated over centuries of Earth time. The Enlil faction maintained official control. The Enki faction worked around the edges, providing knowledge to human populations through the hybrid lineages, through the individuals the fifth tablet described as carriers of the Watcher's seed. The unauthorized transmission of knowledge that the fourth tablet described as one of the reasons for the flood decision was, in the sixth tablet's account, a calculated act by the Enki faction, not a failure of discipline, a deliberate program of human development conducted against official policy. The flood decision by the Enlil faction was therefore not just a response to human overpopulation and the spread of forbidden knowledge. It was a move in a conflict between two factions of the Great Ones, a way of wiping out the progress the Enki faction had made, resetting the board. And the Enki faction's preservation of human survivors and their knowledge, the seed bank, the selected individuals warned to build vessels, was not just compassion, it was a countermove, ensuring that what had been built would survive the reset and could be rebuilt. The sixth tablet described the aftermath of the flood as a period of uneasy truce. The Enlil faction's primary objective had been achieved. The population was gone, or nearly so. The unauthorized knowledge programs had been disrupted. The hybrid lineages had been largely eliminated, though not completely. The survivors were, for the moment, sufficiently reduced and sufficiently shaken that strict management was possible again. But the conflict had not been resolved. It had only been paused. What followed, the text described as a series of proxy conflicts. As human civilization began to rebuild after the flood, the two factions of the Great Ones worked through human intermediaries. Cities aligned with one faction rose against cities aligned with the other. Kingdoms went to war. The human historical record, the Sumerian king list's endless sequence of dynasties rising and falling, the wars of the ancient world, the destruction of cities that archaeology documents and that texts describe. Much of it was a human theater for a divine conflict. This is one of the most difficult aspects of the sixth tablet's account for modern readers to process, because it requires accepting that a significant portion of human history as we know it was not made by humans. That the wars, the empires, the catastrophic destructions of ancient civilizations were at least partly the product of a conflict that had nothing to do with us. That we were collateral in a war between two factions of our creators. The tablet ended, according to the translation accounts, with a period it described as the Great Withdrawal. At some point, after the flood and its aftermath, the physical presence of the Great Ones on Earth diminished. The tablet described this not as an abandonment, but as a strategic repositioning. The factional conflict had become too visible, too embedded in the human civilizations that had grown up around the Great Ones' bases of operation. The risk of direct confrontation was rising. The decision was made by both factions, apparently in a rare moment of agreement, to reduce direct engagement and manage the human population through more indirect means. Bloodlines, institutions, religious systems that encoded the factions' respective ideologies without requiring the Great One's physical presence to maintain them. The religions of the ancient world, the sixth tablet reportedly implied, were the management software left behind after the administrators departed. And the conflict between those religions, the wars of faith that have defined so much of human history, were the continued expression of a conflict that began among beings who were not human at all. The seventh tablet addressed something that researchers found simultaneously the most incredible and the most verifiable of the 9 tablets' contents, because it related to the Sumerian king list, a document we actually have, and to questions about human longevity that the ancient world took completely seriously and that modern science is only now beginning to approach from an entirely different direction. The Sumerian king list is a remarkable document. It lists the rulers of the Sumerian city-states from the earliest period of recorded history, giving the name of each king and the length of their reign. The pre-flood rulers, the antediluvian kings, are listed with reign lengths that are extraordinary. Alulim, the first king, reigned for 28,800 years. Aljar reigned for 36,000 years. Enmenluana reigned for 43,200 years. The antediluvian kings collectively held power for 241,200 years. spread across 8 rulers. Then the flood. After the flood, the reign lengths dropped dramatically. Still long by modern standards, but within the range of centuries rather than tens of thousands of years. And by the time we reach the historical period, the historical kings, whose reigns can be cross-referenced with other evidence, the lengths are normal human lifespans. Mainstream historians treat the pre-flood reign lengths as mythological hyperbole. They weren't meant to be literal, the argument goes. Long reigns indicate great kings, divine favor, cosmic legitimacy. The numbers are symbolic. This is probably the most rational explanation available within the conventional historical framework, but the 7th tablet apparently offered a different one. The text reportedly described the antediluvian reign lengths as records of the actual tenure of the Great Ones in their respective administrative roles, not human kings, the Great Ones themselves. The reason the reign lengths are so long is that the beings listed were not human. They lived for periods that humans would experience as geological time. The Vedic texts of ancient India describe the ages of the gods in similar terms. In Hindu cosmology, the gods live for billions of years in human time. The great cycles of cosmic time, the yugas and the kalpas, operate on scales that dwarf human history. Ancient traditions across the world describe divine beings for whom human timescales are trivial, but the 7th tablet reportedly went further than simply establishing that the Great Ones lived long lives. It described how and why. The text described the Great Ones as having, within their biology, something that the tablet characterized using terms that combined words for renewal and the inner fire or the inner force, a mechanism of biological regeneration. Not immortality in the absolute sense. The Great Ones could die. They were killed in the conflicts described in the 6th tablet. But absent violent death or catastrophic environmental damage, their biology had a default setting that modern humans do not have. It renewed itself. The mechanisms described in the tablet, translated into concepts we now have language for, sounded to researchers like a description of biological aging processes and their suppression. Telomeres, the protective caps on chromosomes that shorten with each cell division and whose shortening is one of the primary drivers of biological aging, were not named in the text, obviously, since Sumerian had no word for chromosomes. But the concept of an inner counting that limited the number of times the body's building blocks could reproduce before they became used and broken was apparently in the 7th tablet. And the Great Ones' bodies, the text said, did not have the same limitation. The counting was either much slower or effectively absent. Modern geroscience, the science of aging, has in recent decades identified the biological mechanisms of aging with increasing precision: telomere shortening, mitochondrial dysfunction, cellular senescence, the process by which cells stop dividing and begin secreting inflammatory signals, the accumulation of genetic errors across a lifetime of cell division. And researchers in this field have begun identifying interventions that can slow or partially reverse these processes in animal models. Mice with extended lifespans, cells whose aging is measurably reversed. The science of radical life extension, once the province of science fiction, is now a serious field with serious funding. The question researchers are working toward is essentially the same question the 7th tablet apparently addressed. Why do biological organisms age at all? Aging is not inevitable from a thermodynamic standpoint. It is a feature, coded into genomes, selected for by evolution in some contexts and not others. Some species are effectively non-aging. The naked mole rat shows negligible senescence. Certain sea turtles show no measurable increase in mortality rate as they age. The processes that cause human aging are not universal biological laws. They are specific features of our specific biology. Features, the 2nd tablet reportedly implied, that were deliberately designed. If the cognitive cap described in the 2nd tablet was engineered, so was the shortened lifespan. If humanity was built to be a worker population that would not develop beyond its intended parameters, then a built-in aging and death mechanism makes complete functional sense. A population that lived as long as its creators would eventually accumulate enough experience, knowledge, and political power to challenge them. A population with a built-in expiration date would not. The 7th tablet reportedly described the lifespan limitation in exactly these terms. And it described something else: the existence, throughout human history, of individuals who had partial access to the Great One's longevity mechanisms. Not full immortality, not the complete regenerative biology of the Great Ones, but a reduced aging rate, a longer than normal human lifespan. The hybrid lineages, carriers of the Watcher's seed, lived longer than baseline humans. The biblical patriarchs, Adam lived 930 years. Methuselah, famously, 969 years. Noah, 950 years. The pre-flood patriarchs are listed in Genesis with lifespans that mainstream biblical scholarship treats as either literal or symbolic, depending on the theological tradition. But they follow the same pattern as the Sumerian king list: very long lives before the flood, declining lifespans after it. The seventh tablet reportedly gave a biological explanation for this pattern. The dilution of the Great One's genetic material through generations of interbreeding with baseline humans reduced the expression of the longevity mechanisms in each subsequent generation. The first generation of hybrids lived very long. Their children, more diluted, lived somewhat less long. By the time you reach the historical period, the genetic legacy has been distributed through so many generations of the human population that the effect is barely measurable. Just at the far tail of the human lifespan distribution, a few individuals who live to exceptional ages, and most scientists treat this as statistical variation. The seventh tablet suggested it was something else. The last fading signal of an inheritance that was once much stronger, and it suggested that the inheritance was not gone, just dormant. The mechanisms for much longer human lifespan were present in the genome. They were simply switched off. The tablet describes specific conditions under which these dormant mechanisms could be partially reactivated. The conditions included nutritional, environmental, and what the text described as the inner practice of knowing, the same category of knowledge that the fifth tablet described as one of the legacies left for humanity after the flood. The connection between the two tablets was explicit. The knowledge of the inner organizing force was not only spiritually significant, it was biologically functional. The practice of it could influence the expression of dormant genetic mechanisms. This is a claim that would be dismissed as mysticism in any mainstream scientific context. And yet the field of epigenetics, which studies how environmental and behavioral factors influence gene expression without changing the underlying DNA sequence, has demonstrated definitively that what you do, what you eat, how you manage stress, how you practice focused attention, these things genuinely and measurably affect which genes are switched on and off in your cells. The idea that specific mental practices could influence genetic expression is no longer science fiction. It is published, peer-reviewed science. The seventh tablet reportedly described this mechanism thousands of years before the word epigenetics existed. The eighth tablet was, according to the researchers who discussed it, the most visually striking of the 9. Unlike the others, which were primarily textual, this one was described as containing images alongside the cuneiform text, diagrams, representations, what appeared to be a map, not a map of Earth, a map of the heavens, but a heavens map that included something unusual. It marked specific locations and labeled them in ways that made researchers believe they were looking at a record of where the Great Ones came from and where. In the period following their withdrawal from Earth, they went. The idea of a star map in ancient Sumerian archaeological context is not without precedent. In 1965, archaeologist Willy Ley published an analysis of a cuneiform tablet in the Stadtmuseum in Nuremberg that appeared to represent a star map, including constellation designations and what might be orbital paths. The tablet's origins are disputed. More recently, researchers analyzing various ancient sites have argued that the layout of major monument complexes, including the Giza pyramids and the temples at Angkor Wat in Cambodia, encoded maps of specific stellar configurations that the builders considered significant. The star map in the eighth tablet reportedly went considerably further than any of these. The text accompanying the map described locations, named stars or star systems. The tablet used terms that researchers could only partially correlate with the star names used in canonical Sumerian astronomy, which was itself sophisticated enough that modern astronomers use Sumerian star names to this day. But some of the names in the eighth tablet did not appear anywhere in the known Sumerian astronomical corpus. Either they were stars that Sumerian astronomers had not yet catalogued by the period of the canonical texts, or they were identified by a naming system that was not Sumerian in origin. One star name in the eighth tablet generated particular attention. The translation accounts describe a name that researchers tentatively identified as referring to a binary star system, a system in which two stars orbit each other, in the general direction of the constellation Orion. This is where things get either very interesting or very fraught, depending on your perspective. Zecharia Sitchin argued that the Anunnaki came from a planet he called Nibiru, which he identified as an undiscovered planet in our own solar system on a very long elliptical orbit. His interpretation of the Sumerian astronomical texts as describing a 12-planet solar system, including Nibiru, has been largely rejected by mainstream astronomers. who note that a planet with the orbital characteristics Sitchin described would have disruptive effects on the orbits of the existing planets that we would be able to detect and that are not present. But the 8th tablet, as described in the translation accounts, did not match Sitchin's description. It did not describe an undiscovered planet within our solar system. It described a location outside our solar system entirely, a binary star system at some distance from our Sun. The map included what appeared to be a notation of travel time between this system and our own, and the figure was rendered in units that researchers could not convert precisely to modern astronomical measures, but which suggested an enormous distance. A journey that required technology and timescales far beyond anything in the human experience. If the Great Ones came from another star system, the implications for every aspect of what the other tablets described compound dramatically. It would mean that the technology required to travel between stars existed at a point in history well before anything in our current scientific understanding. Our fastest spacecraft, Voyager 1, launched in 1977, would take approximately 73,000 years to reach the nearest star system to ours. Any beings capable of interstellar travel would need to have either solved the problem of traveling at a significant fraction of the speed of light, or found some other solution to the limitations imposed by distance and time. The 8th tablet apparently described the journey not as something routine, but also not as something miraculous. It was technology. Difficult, demanding, requiring resources and planning, but fundamentally a technical problem with a technical solution. The text described the journey as having been undertaken in stages, with what appeared to be stopping points along the way. Intermediate locations where the travelers paused, presumably for resupply or maintenance. This detail, the staging posts in interstellar travel, is not something a Bronze Age Sumerian would have any reason to invent. It's not a useful mythological element. It doesn't make the gods more impressive. It actually makes their journey sound logistically complicated, even difficult, which is precisely how a historical record would describe a real event. The second component of the 8th tablet, the star map's designation of where the Great Ones went after their withdrawal from Earth, pointed in a different direction from the point of origin. Not back to where they came from, or not entirely. The map appeared to show multiple locations throughout the wider solar system and beyond. Stations, outposts. Researchers found this section of the map the most difficult to interpret because it required them to speculate about whether what the tablet described as outpost locations corresponded to anything that modern astronomy had identified. They made several tentative correlations, none of which they were confident about, involving locations within our own solar system. The tablet seemed to indicate that the Great Ones did not leave our solar neighborhood entirely after their withdrawal from Earth. They redistributed. They positioned themselves at multiple points within the system, and they continued to observe. The 8th tablet's text, as opposed to its map component, described this observation as ongoing. The Great Ones who withdrew from Earth did not simply leave. They watched. They maintained records. They monitored the development of the human civilization that continued in their absence. And the text described the existence of a specific protocol, a threshold. When humanity reached a specific level of technological and cognitive development, a level the text described using terms that combined ideas of great knowing and the fire that carries the word across the sky, there would be a response. The fire that carries the word across the sky. Researchers who reviewed this phrase spent considerable time trying to identify what it described. Radio waves, electromagnetic radiation, signals that travel at the speed of light across astronomical distances. The description, translated from a language that had no vocabulary for electromagnetic physics, is startlingly apt. We have been broadcasting radio waves into space since the early 20th century. Our signals have now reached a distance of roughly 100 light-years in all directions from Earth. Any civilization with the capacity to detect them within that sphere would know we are here, would know something about us. The 8th tablet reportedly described this threshold as having been passed, as something that had already occurred within the timeline of the tablet's composition. Whether the composition predated or postdated the threshold was one of the interpretive problems the researchers couldn't resolve. But the protocol, the tablet said, was clear. The watching would be followed, at the designated threshold, by return. The 9th tablet was the last, and reportedly the most personal in tone, the most direct in its address to the reader. Where the other tablets recorded history, described processes, cataloged knowledge, the 9th appeared to speak directly to whoever would eventually find and read these words. Researchers who reviewed the translation accounts described the tone shift as jarring, almost as if the document changed authors. The first 8 tablets, whatever their extraordinary content, were written in the registers of official record-keeping and technical documentation. The ninth was written in something closer to the second person. It addressed those who find these words in the time after. The time after. After what? The tablet was not entirely clear, but the context of the other 8 tablets suggested after everything they described. After the flood, after the withdrawal, after the long period of human civilization building toward the threshold. The ninth tablet opened with a summary statement that researchers found almost unbearably concise given everything the other 8 tablets contained. It said, in translation, something like, "What was done with purpose. The purpose was not what you have been told. You were not created to be small. You were created small so that you could become large. The smallness was a beginning, not a sentence. You were not created to be small. You were created small so that you could become large. The smallness was a beginning, not a sentence." Researchers who saw this translation reported that the phrase stopped them, not because it was poetic, though it was, but because it directly addressed the most troubling implication of what the other 8 tablets described, that humanity was engineered to be limited, controlled, managed, and kept small. That our cognitive cap, our shortened lifespan, our position as a worker species in someone else's operation, was a permanent condition deliberately imposed. The ninth tablet said that was not the whole story. The text continued with what appeared to be a description of a long-term plan. Not a plan for the Great One's permanent domination of Earth and humanity, a plan for graduation. The tablet used terms that researchers rendered as something like the teaching of the young, or the raising of what was made into what it can be. The relationship between the Great Ones and humanity, the ninth tablet argued, was always intended to be temporary in its current form. The control and limitation were not the final state. They were the initial conditions of a process that was always meant to evolve. This framing, if accurate, would recontextualize everything in the other 8 tablets. The cognitive cap was not permanent suppression. It was a training wheel. The shortened lifespan was not a permanent sentence. It was a development phase. The factional conflict between the Enlil and Enki schools of thought, described in the 6th tablet, was a genuine dispute about the timeline. The Enlil faction wanted a slower graduation, more control, more time. The Enki faction wanted to accelerate it, to give humanity the tools to develop faster. The flood was a setback, a delay. The Great Withdrawal was a change in method, not an abandonment. The indirect management through bloodlines and religious systems was not the end state. It was a different phase of the same project. The ninth tablet described specific signs that would indicate humanity was approaching the graduation threshold. The development of technologies for rapid global communication. The accumulation and distribution of knowledge to the point where any individual could access what all individuals knew. The development of tools that could extend and augment human cognitive capacity. The creation of artificial minds that could model complexity beyond human cognitive reach. Global communication networks, the internet, artificial intelligence. Researchers who reviewed this section of the ninth tablet's translation found themselves in an uncomfortable position, because the descriptions in the text matched the trajectory of human technological development so precisely that they could not easily dismiss them as coincidence. And yet accepting them as accurate prophecy opened a series of questions that had no comfortable answers. Was the acceleration of human technology, particularly in the last 2 centuries, a natural consequence of human development, or was it guided? Was the Industrial Revolution, the Information Revolution, the Artificial Intelligence Revolution, was all of this happening at the pace it was happening because something was facilitating it? Because the project managers, the watchers described in the 8th tablet, were adjusting conditions to move humanity toward the threshold on a specific timeline? The 9th tablet did not directly answer that question. But it addressed the question of what the threshold arrival would mean. The text described a reunion, not a conquest, not a return of overlords demanding submission. A reunion. A meeting between what the Great Ones had been at the time of their departure and what humanity would have become by the time the threshold was reached. The tablet was explicit that neither party would be the same. The Great Ones, over the millennia since their withdrawal, had continued their own development. Humanity, over the same period, had transformed from the worker species of the original design into something the Great Ones had not fully anticipated. Something like what the Enki faction had always argued humanity could become. The ninth tablet then contained what researchers described as its most sobering section, a warning, not a threat from the Great Ones, a description of risks that the period of reunion would carry. The first risk was what the text called the blindness of long comfort. Humanity, by the time of the threshold, would have developed systems and beliefs that explained the world in ways that did not include the Great Ones or their legacy, science, religion in its conventional forms. political and economic systems built on assumptions about human nature and human history that would be fundamentally challenged by what the reunion revealed. The text warned that this challenge would be deeply destabilizing. That many humans would reject what the reunion revealed, because accepting it would require dismantling most of what they believed about themselves. The second risk was what the text called those who know and use for themselves. Among the human population at the time of the threshold, there would be individuals and groups who would maintain knowledge of the great ones, of the lineages, of the true history. These were the carriers of the legacy from the fifth tablet, the hereditary knowledge keepers. But the tablet warned that long isolation had corrupted some of them. That knowledge of the true history, combined with positions of power in human institutions, had been used to maintain control rather than to prepare humanity for the reunion. Some of those who knew the most had used their knowledge to perpetuate the management system, to keep humanity smaller than it needed to remain, for their own benefit. The gatekeepers who became guards. The third risk was the one that researchers found most difficult to read without a personal response. The text warned that there would be attempts to suppress information about the reunion and what preceded it. The ninth tablet was itself apparently one of multiple attempts by what the text called those who wished for the faster time, the Enki faction's legacy, to ensure that the true history would be available to humanity when the threshold arrived. The tablet described multiple transmission efforts across multiple periods of history. Documents, monuments, lineages, individuals, all carrying pieces of the complete picture. And it described opposition to these transmissions, suppression, destruction of records, the silencing of those who carried the knowledge. The text was direct about this. It said that efforts to hide the truth would succeed for a time, but would not ultimately succeed, because the truth was encoded too widely, distributed across too many carriers, for any single suppression effort to eliminate it completely. The 9 tablets themselves, the physical clay artifacts found in the sands near Eridu, were described within the 9th tablet as one of these transmission efforts. The tablet acknowledged that it might not survive, that it might be destroyed or hidden or suppressed. And it expressed this not with grief, but with something more like confidence. Because even if these specific tablets were lost, the information was elsewhere. In other tablets, in oral traditions, in the orientation of stones and the alignment of monuments and the persistent myths of cultures that had never met each other and yet told the same stories. The suppression of these 9 tablets, assuming the accounts of their destruction are accurate, was not the first time this had happened. The 9th tablet said it would not be the last. But it also said that suppression was becoming harder, that the period when information could be locked away and kept from the general population was ending, that the same technologies that indicated the approach of the threshold also made permanent suppression of information effectively impossible. The 9th tablet ended with a phrase that translators found almost impossible to render precisely in English because it used a grammatical construction that doesn't exist in modern languages. The closest approximation researchers could offer was something like, "What was made remembers what it is," or "The created ones carry, in their making, the knowledge of what made them," or, in its most condensed form, "You already know." You already know. Not a statement about the conscious mind, about something deeper, the genetic memory perhaps, the dormant longevity mechanisms of the 7th tablet, the intuitive access to the organizing force described in the 5th, the inexplicable feeling, reported by humans across cultures and throughout history, of being part of something larger than what the conventional story explains. The sense that the mythologies we inherited, however encoded and distorted and reinterpreted through millennia of cultural transmission, are pointing at something real. You already know. The account of what happened after the translation was completed in autumn of 1979 is a story within the story, and it's important to tell it as precisely as the available evidence allows. The translation team submitted their documentation to the Iraqi Ministry of Culture, as was required under the terms of their excavation permit. This much appears in the official correspondence that was preserved by the German university involved in the consortium. The submission was acknowledged. The Iraqi authorities took possession of the documents and the physical tablets which had remained at the excavation site and were transported to Baghdad. What happened after that point is where the accounts diverge, and where the story becomes a documentation of institutional behavior rather than ancient history. Within the consortium of Western institutions involved in the excavation, the members of the translation team who had worked directly with the tablets began, in the months following the submission to Iraqi authorities, to encounter resistance to discussing or publishing their findings. One researcher, a Assyriologist at the British institution involved, later described attempting to present preliminary findings at a conference in 1980 and being asked by a senior administrator at her institution to withdraw the presentation. She was told the Iraqi authorities had classified the materials and that any publication would create diplomatic complications. Diplomatic complications. That phrase was repeated in various forms by multiple researchers who encountered resistance. It was never specified what the complications would be, what diplomatic relationships would be damaged, what the mechanism of damage would be. It was simply presented as a reason that further discussion was premature. The translation documents submitted to Iraqi authorities remained classified within the Iraqi Cultural Administration. In 1991, during the Gulf War, the Iraq Museum in Baghdad was damaged in bombing. In 2003, during the Second Gulf War, the Iraq Museum was looted extensively. More than 15,000 artifacts went missing. Some have been recovered. Many have not. Whether the translation documents from the Hereditary excavation were among the materials lost in 2003, or whether they had been removed or destroyed earlier, is not known. The physical tablets themselves, the 9 clay artifacts found in the sands near Eridu in the summer of 1978, have never appeared in any public catalog of Iraqi archaeological holdings. They were not listed among the items known to have been looted from the Iraq Museum. They were not listed among items recovered from looters and returned to Iraqi custody. They exist in no publicly accessible record of physical artifacts. This absence is either the result of poor record-keeping in a country that has experienced multiple wars and political upheavals, which is a completely reasonable explanation, or it is the result of deliberate removal from the record, which is a much more troubling one. The researchers who spoke, carefully and often anonymously, about what they had seen and translated did so over a period of decades. Some of them waited until they were near the ends of their careers before speaking. Some spoke only in private correspondence that was shared after their deaths. None of them spoke publicly in a way that allowed for the kind of verification that mainstream academic culture requires. Peer review, physical access to primary sources, corroboration from institutional records. This is the epistemological problem at the center of suppressed history research. The very act of suppression removes the evidence that would allow the suppression to be proven. You cannot verify the contents of a document that no longer exists. You cannot independently confirm a translation that only a small team performed and that was never published. You can only weigh the accounts of the people who were there, evaluate their credibility, and decide what you believe in the absence of conclusive proof. What we can say with confidence is this: the institutional behavior described by the researchers who spoke about this excavation is entirely consistent with the institutional behavior that has been documented in other cases of suppressed or delayed archaeological publication. The pace at which significant findings move from excavation to publication is notoriously slow. The politics of archaeology, particularly in politically sensitive regions, are well documented as a constraint on open publication. And the specific incentives for suppressing information that challenges foundational assumptions of human history, whether those incentives are institutional, political, or financial, are not difficult to identify. Academic institutions have reputations built on established consensus. Challenging the consensus with extraordinary claims invites scrutiny that most institutions prefer to avoid. Governments have interests in controlling narratives about the ancient history of their territories. Private funding sources for archaeological work sometimes come with expectations about outcomes. The infrastructure of acceptable knowledge has many stakeholders, and extraordinary claims threaten many of them. None of this constitutes proof that the 9 tablets said what the accounts claim they said. But it constitutes a context in which the suppression of such information would be entirely rational from the perspective of those in a position to suppress it. The 9 tablets are not alone. They exist within a pattern of suppression, delay, and institutional resistance that runs throughout the history of ancient history research. Understanding that pattern is essential to evaluating not just the 9 tablets but the entire enterprise of forbidden history. The Denisovans. In 2010, DNA extracted from a finger bone found in a Siberian cave revealed the existence of an entirely unknown species of human, the Denisovans, who coexisted with Homo sapiens and interbred with them. The implications of this discovery were staggering. We had lived for decades with a model of human prehistory that included only 2 archaic human species, Homo sapiens and Neanderthals. The discovery of a third genetically distinct population that interbred with our direct ancestors required a complete revision of our understanding of human prehistory. That revision happened. The scientists involved published. The finding was accepted, replicated, and integrated into the mainstream. This is how science is supposed to work. But the Denisovan discovery also demonstrated something else. For the entire period before 2010, our model of human prehistory was fundamentally wrong. We had been teaching, across all the institutions of education in the world, a story of human origins that was missing a major player. Not because the Denisovans were suppressed, but because the evidence hadn't been found yet, and once it was found and published, the story changed. This should inspire humility. If our model was that wrong about a piece of human prehistory as recently as 2010, what other pieces of the model are wrong? What other players are we missing? What other evidence is buried in archives, waiting for translation, sitting in caves, or lying in the sands of southern Iraq? Göbekli Tepe was discovered in 1994 and formally excavated beginning in 1995. It is 12,000 years old. For the entire history of archaeology before 1995, its existence was unknown, and our timeline of human civilization did not account for it. Its discovery required a revision of what we believed was possible for human societies in the pre-agricultural era. That revision is ongoing. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. The evidence that a cosmic impact event triggered catastrophic climate change approximately 12,000 years ago was published in scientific literature beginning in 2007. It has been contested, debated, and repeatedly evaluated. As of recent years, the evidence base has grown to the point where a significant number of researchers in relevant fields consider it a viable, well-supported hypothesis. If confirmed definitively, it would explain the geological evidence for a catastrophic event at the dawn of human civilization, and it would intersect with flood myths from cultures around the world in a way that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. The Library of Alexandria, the famous repository of ancient knowledge, said to have contained hundreds of thousands of scrolls, including works from civilizations that predated Greece and Rome. It was destroyed, in stages, over centuries, through a combination of fires and political decisions. What was in those scrolls we will never fully know. Some of what was lost may have been mundane. Some of it was certainly significant. The possibility that it included records that would change our understanding of human prehistory is not zero, and it is worth sitting with the magnitude of that loss. The Vatican's secret archives, not secret in the sense of being unknown, but restricted in terms of access. Millions of documents, spanning 12 centuries of institutional history, held in a facility that scholars can access only under controlled conditions with specific permissions. What is in those documents? Many things, undoubtedly. Some of them, certainly, relate to the handling of information that the Church found inconvenient. The archives hold records of the Inquisition, of the suppression of scientific findings, of decisions made about what would be considered acceptable knowledge and what would not. The pattern is not a conspiracy in the sense of a single coordinated effort by a unified group with a clear agenda. It is more dispersed and more structural than that. It is the natural consequence of knowledge being filtered through institutions that have interests in the stability of existing paradigms, combined with the genuine difficulty of verifying extraordinary claims through conventional evidentiary methods. The result is that we live with a version of our own history that is demonstrably incomplete, potentially significantly distorted, and guarded by institutional structures that have strong incentives to resist revision. Everything we've covered tonight lands on a single question that each person watching this must answer for themselves. What do you do with information that you cannot verify through conventional channels? Because that is the situation. The 9 tablets cannot be located. The physical artifacts are gone. The translation documents are inaccessible. The researchers who spoke about them did so under conditions that preclude the kind of third-party verification that would allow the account to be confirmed or refuted. What remains is the pattern. The content of these tablets, if the accounts are accurate, fits within a larger pattern of ancient texts and archaeological evidence that is already on the record, already translated, already available. The Atrahasis epic, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Sumerian king list, the Vedic texts, the Enochian materials, the megalithic monuments, the genetic anomalies, the unexplained accelerations in human behavioral modernity, the flood myths from cultures around the world, the astronomical encodings in ancient architecture. The 9 tablets would not exist in isolation. They would be one more data point in a pattern that is already large enough to take seriously on its own terms. And the pattern says something that the conventional story of human history does not, that we may not know who we are, that our origins may be more complicated, more intentional, and more connected to a larger cosmic story than the standard narrative acknowledges. That the myths and religions and traditions that have guided human civilization may be distorted memories of actual events, filtered through thousands of years of cultural transmission and deliberate editorial control. The Sumerians themselves said they didn't invent their knowledge. They said it was given to them by the Anunnaki, by beings who came from the heavens. They said it plainly, in texts that have been translated and cataloged and mostly ignored by a mainstream scholarship that treats the claim as metaphor. What if it wasn't metaphor? What if the most ancient human civilization on Earth was telling the truth about where it came from? That is not a question that requires you to abandon critical thinking. It requires the opposite. It requires you to look at the evidence, all of it, not just the evidence that fits the accepted story, and to ask what it actually says when you let it speak without filtering it through 2 centuries of materialist assumptions about what is and isn't possible. The Sumerians looked up at the same sky we look at tonight. They tracked the stars with a precision we still find astonishing. They encoded the precession of the equinoxes, a 26,000-year astronomical cycle, into their cosmology. They described, in texts that have survived for 5,000 years, beings of immense power and knowledge who came from the heavens, who created humanity, who fought among themselves over how to manage what they had made, who eventually withdrew, but who left traces of themselves in our biology, our myths, our monuments, and our persistent sense that there is more to the story than we've been told. 9 tablets, reportedly destroyed after their contents were recorded. The contents, according to the researchers who saw them, describe the fuller version of what the canonical Sumerian texts only hint at: the actual arrival, the genetic engineering, the city of the gods. The true account of the flood, the knowledge deliberately left behind, the war among the creators, the record of how long they lived and why we don't, the star map that told them where to go when they left, and the promise, addressed to those who find these words in the time after, that what was done with purpose. The smallness was a beginning, not a sentence. Those 9 tablets may be gone, but the 9th tablet said that suppression would not be final, that the truth was encoded too widely for any single effort to eliminate it. You are watching this. Somewhere, someone translated those tablets, and some part of what they contained is in this story. Some part of what the ancient Sumerians recorded about their own origins, about where they came from and who made them, has survived. Not everything that is buried stays buried. Not every library that burns takes all its books with it. Not every silence, however long, is forever. The tablets were destroyed. The words remain. Before we go further into the implications of what these 9 tablets reportedly contained, there's a conversation that needs to happen about the state of Mesopotamian archaeology itself. Because understanding why these tablets could be suppressed, and why that suppression would be considered rational by the institutions involved, requires understanding the sociology of knowledge in the academic world. This isn't abstract. It has direct consequences for what we are and are not permitted to know about our own origins. The field of Assyriology, the academic discipline responsible for translating and interpreting cuneiform texts, is one of the smallest specialized fields in academia. Globally, the number of trained Assyriologists who can read and interpret complex cuneiform texts at a high level is measured in the low hundreds. This tiny community controls access to the interpretation of hundreds of thousands of untranslated tablets. They publish in a small number of specialized journals. They review each other's work. They share institutional affiliations and professional dependencies. They are, in the most precise sociological sense, a closed community with powerful incentives toward consensus and powerful disincentives toward heterodoxy. This is not a criticism of the scholars themselves. Every specialized academic field has this structure to some degree. The structure is the natural consequence of expertise being rare and community being necessary for the maintenance of standards. The peer review system, whatever its flaws, exists for good reasons. The problem is not the system. The problem is what the system does when confronted with evidence that challenges the assumptions on which the community's entire interpretive framework is built. When Zecharia Sitchin published The 12th Planet in 1976, he was not a credentialed Assyriologist. He was a journalist and scholar who had taught himself to read Sumerian and Akkadian. His translations were attacked as inaccurate by professional Assyriologists. Some of the specific criticisms were valid. His linguistic methodology was disputed on specific points. But the more interesting question, the question that the professional critique largely sidestepped, was whether the underlying pattern of content in the Sumerian texts was, as his translations suggested, regardless of the precise linguistic details. And on that question, the mainstream response was essentially silence, because acknowledging that the Sumerian text described, in any literal sense, what Sitchin claimed they described would require the field to engage with a set of implications that have no place in the conventional academic framework. The Anunnaki as physical beings from another world, genetic engineering, interstellar travel. These are not categories that Assyriological training equips scholars to evaluate. They fall outside the interpretive toolkit that the field has developed. And when something falls outside the toolkit, the default response in any specialized discipline is to dismiss it as outside the field's scope, not to develop new tools to address it. This is how suppression often works without any conspiracy. Not through active coordination, through the passive operation of institutional incentives that make heterodox conclusions professionally costly and orthodox conclusions professionally safe. The researchers who worked on the Eridu excavation of 1978 were, by most accounts, not fringe scholars. They were credentialed, employed by reputable institutions, working under an official permit in a methodologically rigorous excavation. When their findings created institutional discomfort, the suppression they encountered was not dramatic. It was bureaucratic. It was a withdrawn conference presentation, a recommendation to wait until the political situation clarifies, a quiet withholding of institutional support for publication, the kind of soft suppression that leaves no fingerprints and that the individuals involved can always rationalize as prudent caution rather than censorship. The result is the same as dramatic suppression. The information doesn't reach the public. The tablets, whether destroyed or simply inaccessible, do not enter the scholarly record. The researchers who saw them grow older, and the further they get from the moment of the discovery, the less credible their accounts become to those who were not present. By the time they're ready to speak openly, they're elderly, the institutional record has been closed for decades, and the claim that they once saw extraordinary tablets near Eridu sounds, to anyone who wasn't there, like the fading memory of an old academic, rather than a documented historical event. This is why the sociology matters, not because it proves the tablets said what the accounts claim, but because it explains why the absence of formal documentation cannot be taken as evidence that the tablets were unremarkable or fictional. The documentation was created, the documentation was submitted, the documentation was taken into a system that then sealed it from public access. The sequence of those events is not disputed by the institutional record. What disappeared into the system is what we're trying to understand. The second tablet's account of genetic engineering, of the deliberate modification of a primate species to produce humanity, is where the intersection between ancient texts and modern science becomes most uncomfortable for mainstream discourse. Because modern genetics has, in the last 2 decades, produced a series of findings that do not fit comfortably into the standard Darwinian narrative of gradual natural selection and that have not been adequately integrated into the popular understanding of human origins. Let's go through them systematically. First, the chromosome fusion. As noted earlier, human chromosome 2 is a fusion of 2 ancestral chromosomes that still exist separately in other great apes. The fusion is confirmed. The mechanism is established. What is not adequately explained is why a chromosome number change, which is almost always lethal or at minimum causes infertility in the generation in which it occurs, produce not just a viable individual but a founding population for a new species. For a new species to arise from a chromosome number change in a natural population, you need a founding individual with the mutation to successfully breed with another individual who also carries it, at a rate sufficient to produce a viable breeding subpopulation. In natural populations, chromosome number changes are almost always evolutionary dead ends, for exactly this reason. The math of population genetics makes spontaneous speciation through chromosome number change extraordinarily rare. Not impossible, but rare enough that each instance is considered a significant event requiring explanation. The conventional explanation for human chromosome 2 fusion is that it happened, it was compatible with viability, and natural selection proceeded from there. The explanation is plausible. But it's also the kind of explanation that relies on the inherent improbability of the event being masked by the enormity of geological time. Given enough time and enough generations, even very rare events happen. The question the second tablet raises is whether this particular event was random. Second, the Neanderthal and Denisovan admixture. Modern genetic sequencing has now established that modern humans outside of sub-Saharan Africa carry approximately 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA. Humans in parts of Southeast Asia and Oceania carry additional Denisovan DNA. The interbreeding happened. The genetic evidence is conclusive. This means that at some point in human prehistory, Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalensis and the Denisovans were sharing territory and producing viable offspring, which in turn means these groups were either the same species or closely related enough that reproduction across the boundary was not impossible. What this does to the species concept in biology is philosophically interesting. But what it does to the story of human origins is more practically relevant. Our genome is a mosaic, It is not the product of a single lineage evolving cleanly from a common ancestor. It is the product of multiple rounds of admixture between populations that were distinct enough to be classified separately. We are, genetically, a hybrid species. The second tablet described the creation of humanity as a deliberate hybridization process. The combination of the Great One's genetic material with that of an existing primate. The tablets we know, the canonical Atrahasis epic, describe humanity as being made from the blood of a slain god mixed with clay. The blood of a god, divine genetic material, combined with earth, with the biological material of the existing earth creatures. We are a hybrid species. The canonical texts say we were made through hybridization. Modern genetics confirms that we are the product of multiple rounds of genetic mixing that are unusual in their nature and consequences. These facts exist in independent domains. The connection between them is not proof of anything, but it is a coincidence significant enough that intellectual honesty requires acknowledging it rather than pretending it isn't there. Third, the FOXP2 gene. FOXP2 is a transcription factor, a gene that regulates the expression of other genes that is associated in humans with the capacity for fine motor control of the vocal tract and with language. In its human form, it differs from the chimpanzee form in two specific amino acids. 2 amino acid differences. This tiny change appears to be one of the key enabling factors in human language capacity, which is arguably the most important single feature that distinguishes human cognition from that of all other animals. The FOXP2 gene, in its human form, appears to have undergone rapid selection relatively recently in human evolutionary history. The changes are not ancient. They postdate the split between human and chimpanzee lineages by a significant margin, and they appear to have spread through the human population quickly by evolutionary standards, suggesting strong selective pressure. Strong selective pressure means something was happening in the human environment that made the language-capable version of FOXP2 dramatically advantageous. What environmental change would have created such strong selective pressure for language? The conventional answer is that the social and cognitive demands of increasingly complex human societies drove selection for language capacity. The more complex the society, the more advantage goes to individuals who can communicate with higher precision. But this is a circular argument. Complex societies require language to organize. Language requires complex social context to be selectively advantageous. The conventional explanation for how this feedback loop began is still debated. The second tablet described the new creature as made able to understand the word, the logos, to use the Greek term, the capacity for language, a created creature, made able to communicate with complex precision so that it could receive and execute complex instructions. If that capacity was engineered, FOXP2 in its human form would be one of the places you would look for the engineering. Fourth, the brain size anomaly. The human brain is dramatically oversized relative to body weight compared to other primates, or compared to what a strictly utilitarian application of natural selection would predict. The metabolic cost of the human brain is enormous. It consumes approximately 20% of the body's caloric intake, while constituting only about 2% of body mass. For natural selection to favor such a metabolically expensive organ, the cognitive advantages it provides would need to be overwhelming. They are: human cognition, at the level it operates, is extraordinarily powerful relative to what was needed for the survival challenges facing pre-agricultural humans. Hunting and gathering on the African savanna, the environmental context in which human brain size supposedly evolved, does not require anything approaching the cognitive capacity of a modern human brain. The capacity for abstract mathematics, for recursive language, for symbolic art, for the construction of complex social hierarchies and legal systems. None of these abilities were necessary for the ecological niche that pre-agricultural Homo sapiens occupied. The brain is over-engineered for its environment. Evolution doesn't typically produce dramatic over-engineering. It produces fit to purpose. The metabolic cost of the human brain should have selected against it in a straightforward environmental selection model, because the energetic investment is so high relative to the basic survival needs it was evolved to meet, unless it was not evolved to meet basic survival needs, unless it was engineered for a purpose that required higher cognitive capacity than basic survival. The second tablet's description of the inner knowing cap, the deliberate limitation of cognitive capacity to keep the new creature useful but not autonomous, takes on different implications in the context of a brain that is dramatically over-engineered for its apparent evolutionary purpose. If the brain is larger than it needs to be for the environmental challenges human ancestors faced, perhaps it was made for a different purpose than those environmental challenges. And the limitations described in the second tablet, the deliberate cognitive suppression, would then be not the reduction of normal brain function, but the suppression of a designed capacity that was already substantially beyond what was needed for simple survival. We are not using our brains to their designed capacity. That is the implication of both the archaeological evidence for the cognitive gap, the long period before modern behavioral complexity despite anatomically modern brains, and the second tablet's description of the cognitive cap. The cap is not natural, it was put there. And the ninth tablet's suggestion that the cap could be partially lifted through the practices described in the fifth tablet and through the activation of dormant genetic mechanisms described in the seventh implies that the full capacity is still there, waiting. Fifth and finally, on the genetic evidence, mitochondrial Eve. Modern genetics has traced the ancestry of all living humans, through the maternal line via mitochondrial DNA to a single woman who lived in Africa approximately 150,000 to 200,000 years ago. She is known as mitochondrial Eve. This does not mean she was the only woman alive at the time. It means all other female lineages from her period have gone extinct over the subsequent generations, leaving only her descendants. Similarly, Y chromosome Adam, traced through the paternal line, locates a single male ancestor approximately 200,000 to 340,000 years ago. The genetic evidence suggests that modern humans descend from a very small founding population. Not a single couple, but a small group. Small enough that a catastrophic reduction in population, a bottleneck, can be detected in the genetic record. The human genome shows signs of having passed through one or more severe population bottlenecks. Periods when the total human population may have been reduced to a few thousand individuals or fewer. The second tablet described the creation of humanity as a deliberate, controlled process. A small founding population, created in a laboratory setting, released into the broader environment. The genetic signatures of a founding bottleneck are exactly what you would expect from such a process. Not from the messy, distributed, multi-generational process of natural evolution, but from a controlled founding event involving a small number of carefully selected progenitors. We look genetically like a designed population, not because the evidence proves design, but because the same genetic signatures that are characteristic of designed founding populations are present in the human genome. None of this is taught in biology class. The individual findings are all in the peer-reviewed literature. The chromosome fusion, the Neanderthal admixture, the FOXP2 changes, the metabolic overinvestment in brain size, the mitochondrial bottleneck, all published, all available. But they are never assembled into a single framework and examined as a whole, because the whole, when assembled, asks a question that the materialist framework of modern biology has no mechanism for answering. Was this designed? The architectural evidence, which the third tablet touched on, and which deserves its own extended examination, tells a story that mainstream archaeology has been grappling with awkwardly for decades. The evidence is physical, it is measurable, and it consistently points toward the same conclusion. In the remote past, human beings or beings operating alongside humans constructed structures that should not have been possible with the tools and organizational capacity attributed to those periods. Let's start with the most studied example, the Great Pyramid of Giza. It is the oldest and only surviving member of the seven wonders of the ancient world. It was built, according to mainstream Egyptology, during the 4th dynasty of ancient Egypt, approximately 4,500 years ago, under the pharaoh Khufu. It is made of approximately 2.3 million stone blocks, each weighing on average 2.5 to 15 tons. Some of the blocks in the interior chambers weigh 80 tons or more. The conventional explanation for how the pyramid was built involves a large, organized labor force, simple but effective technologies including ramps and sledges, and approximately 20 years of continuous work. This explanation is internally consistent and is supported by archaeological evidence of a worker village near Giza and administrative records of food rations for the workers. What the conventional explanation does not adequately address is the precision. The Great Pyramid is aligned to true north with an accuracy of 0.05 degrees, a precision that cannot be achieved without the ability to determine true north with extraordinary exactitude. This level of accuracy was not achieved again in any human construction project until the 20th century, when modern instruments made it routine. The base of the pyramid is level to within 2.1 centimeters across its 230-meter sides. In an era before laser levels, this precision is remarkable. The four sides of the base are equal in length to within an average of 58 millimeters, an error of 0.025%. The internal chambers and passages are aligned with astronomical features, including the southern shaft of the king's chamber pointing toward the star Alnitak in Orion's belt, and the northern shaft pointing toward the star Thuban, which was the pole star, in approximately 2500 BCE. The geological, acoustic, and engineering properties of the pyramid have been studied extensively and continue to produce unexpected findings. The pyramid's geometry encodes the mathematical constant pi in its proportions, at a level of accuracy that a civilization supposedly lacking knowledge of advanced mathematics should not have been able to achieve. The ratio of the perimeter of the base to twice the height is approximately 3.14159, the value of pi. This could be coincidence. The probability of accidental pi encoding at this level of precision is not trivial. The weight of the largest stones in the pyramid, the granite monoliths of the internal chambers, and the question of how they were moved from the quarry at Aswan, more than 800 kilometers away, to the Giza Plateau, and then into their precisely fitted positions inside the structure, remains unresolved by the conventional ramp and sledge model. Experimental archaeologists have demonstrated that some of the movement techniques proposed can work for typical pyramid blocks. They have not demonstrated that they can work for 80-ton granite monoliths being placed in the interior chambers of a 146-meter-tall structure. The Sphinx, whatever its relationship to the pyramid complex, presents its own anomalies. The Sphinx enclosure shows evidence of deep water weathering on its vertical walls. Not wind erosion, not sand erosion, but the kind of vertical weathering caused by prolonged exposure to heavy rainfall. The last time the Giza region received enough rainfall to produce that pattern of weathering was approximately 7,000 to 10,000 years ago. If the Sphinx shows precipitation-induced weathering on its enclosure walls, the enclosure would have to predate or coincide with the period of heavy rainfall, pushing the age of the monument far beyond the conventional 4,500-year estimate. Robert Schoch, a geologist at Boston University, has presented this argument in peer-reviewed geological literature. The Egyptological response has been to dispute the interpretation of the weathering, not to refute the geological evidence itself. The debate continues, but Schoch's argument is not fringe. It is geologically grounded and has been published in mainstream scientific venues. If the Sphinx is older than currently believed, that raises the question of who built it. A sophisticated civilization capable of carving and constructing such a monument would need to have existed in the Nile Valley 10 or more thousand years ago, which puts it in the pre-agricultural, pre-writing, pre-civilization period, according to the conventional timeline. There is no evidence of such a civilization in the conventional record, but there are anomalies in the record that the conventional framework has difficulty accommodating. Göbekli Tepe again, the oldest known monumental architecture on Earth. The scale and sophistication of the carved pillars, the organization required to quarry, transport, and erect T-shaped limestone monoliths weighing 10 to 20 tons each, the deliberate and apparently ritualistic burial of the entire complex under tons of fill, all of this speaks to a level of social organization and architectural capability that the conventional model says should not have existed at that time. The people of Göbekli Tepe, whoever they were, did not leave extensive material evidence of their culture outside of the site itself. No cities, no agriculture apparently, no metals. Just this extraordinary complex of megalithic structures, deliberately constructed, deliberately buried, and now being slowly unearthed after 12,000 years. One of the most interesting features of Göbekli Tepe is the imagery on its pillars. Carved reliefs of animals, some of them easily identifiable as species native to the region, and some that have provoked debate about whether they represent purely naturalistic depictions or something more. The H symbol that appears on some pillars, a motif that has no conventional explanation, recurs in the iconography of other ancient cultures across vast distances. The vulture imagery has been analyzed as potentially encoding astronomical information. The site's arrangement may reflect astronomical alignments. It is as if the builders of Göbekli Tepe were leaving a message, something deliberately encoded into a structure designed to be found later. The burying of the complex, which required enormous labor and seems to have been a deliberate ritual act, preserved the site against the millennia. It is almost as if the builders knew the site needed to last a very long time. The fifth tablet's description of knowledge, encoded into megalithic structures, left for humanity to decode in the period after the flood, fits with the character of Göbekli Tepe in ways that are difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Baalbek in Lebanon contains what may be the most challenging single piece of architectural evidence for the existence of a pre-conventional civilization or non-human technical capability. The Temple of Jupiter at Baalbek was built by the Romans on a platform of enormous stone blocks. The largest of these blocks, known as the trilithon, consists of 3 stones, each weighing approximately 800 tons. A 4th stone, still in the quarry, weighs approximately 1,650 tons. These are the largest worked stones in the ancient world. The Romans were excellent engineers. But they built on top of the platform. They did not build the platform itself. The origin and age of the Baalbek platform are genuinely unknown. The Romans used it. They did not claim to have built it. The local traditions of Lebanon include stories about the platform predating the Romans by a considerable margin. Some accounts attribute it to giants, to divine beings, to a period of history before the currently acknowledged civilizations. How you move an 800-ton stone block with ancient technology is a question that has not been satisfactorily answered. Experimental archaeology has not produced a method that accounts for both the movement and the precision fitting of blocks at this scale. The conventional answer, essentially, is that we haven't figured out how they did it yet, but they did it, and eventually we'll find the evidence of how. This is a reasonable scientific attitude. It is also an attitude that allows for a very long period of not looking too closely at the implications of not having an answer. The 3rd tablet's description of a city whose walls were not made by human hands, and whose construction scale exceeded what conventional Bronze Age humans could have built, fits a pattern of physical evidence that exists independently of the tablets. The tablets don't prove the monuments. The monuments don't prove the tablets. But they rhyme with each other in ways that a serious investigator of human prehistory cannot in good conscience ignore. The 8th tablet's star map intersects with a body of independent research in archaeoastronomy, the study of astronomical knowledge encoded in ancient sites and texts, that has grown substantially over the last 3 decades. What emerges from this research is a picture of ancient astronomical knowledge that far exceeds what conventional models of prehistoric cognition would predict. The precession of the equinoxes, the 26,000-year cycle of Earth's axial wobble that causes the position of the stars at the equinoxes to shift slowly through the 12 signs of the zodiac, requires long-period astronomical observation to detect. To notice the precession, you need records of stellar positions spanning centuries. To calculate the full 26,000-year cycle, you need even longer observation periods, or a level of mathematical sophistication that can extrapolate from shorter observation windows. Mainstream astronomy attributes the discovery of precession to Hipparchus of Nicaea, the Greek astronomer who, around 127 BCE, calculated the precession rate from a comparison of his observations with those of earlier Greek astronomers. This is a discovery we credit to the Hellenistic period, to literate Greek civilization. It is presented as a crowning achievement of ancient scientific thought, but the precession is encoded in traditions that far predate Hipparchus. The Hindu Vedic texts describe astronomical cycles with time periods that only make sense if the authors understood precession. The zodiacal framework itself, the division of the sky into 12 approximately equal sections, makes most astronomical sense as a tool for tracking precessional movement. The Sumerian astronomical tradition, from which Greek astronomy derived most of its star names and much of its organizational framework, incorporated numerical constants that researchers have identified as precession-related, including the number 72, the number of years it takes for the precessional wobble to shift 1 degree. 72, 360, divided by 72 is 5. 72 times 360 is 25,920, the number of years in a complete precessional cycle. These numbers are woven throughout ancient Mesopotamian numerical traditions in ways that appear to be neither accidental nor coincidental. The 8th tablet reportedly included a star map that encoded both the location of origin and precessional time markers. The time markers, if they were present in the tablet, would have served a function that the other tablets alluded to, calibrating when in the cosmic cycle the reunion was expected. Astronomy as a timing mechanism, the stars as a clock, set by those who left and readable by those who were left behind. This use of astronomy, as a long-distance communication tool across time, is one of the most compelling aspects of the alternative history framework. It requires accepting that very ancient peoples, or beings operating through ancient peoples, deliberately encoded information in forms designed to be preserved and decoded much later. But this kind of deliberate encoding is precisely what archaeoastronomers have been finding in ancient sites around the world for decades, and the mainstream field increasingly acknowledges it even if it disputes the more radical interpretations. The alignment of the Giza pyramids with the belt stars of Orion, as proposed by Robert Bauval, encodes a specific moment in time, approximately 10,500 BCE, when the Orion constellation in its precessional cycle was at its lowest point in the sky at the meridian. The layout of the three main Giza pyramids matches the layout of the three belt stars of Orion, and the correlation is most exact at this 10,500 BCE date. Bauval's interpretation is that the Giza complex was either built at that time or was deliberately oriented to encode that date as a reference point. 10,500 BCE is approximately 12,000 years ago. It is the period of the Younger Dryas. It is the approximate period of the catastrophic flooding that geologists have documented. It is the period to which the human behavioral modernity acceleration can be approximately dated. It is the period in which Göbekli Tepe was actively used, before its deliberate burial. All of these lines, the geological evidence for catastrophe, the genetic evidence for bottleneck and rapid change, the astronomical encodings in ancient monuments, the architectural evidence for a pre-conventional civilization, the mythological record of a flood and the beings associated with it, converge on the same window in time. 12,000 years ago, something happened. Something that human civilization has been processing, encoding, and slowly recovering from ever since. The 9 tablets reportedly described what that something was. One of the most persistently interesting aspects of the research into suppressed ancient history is the question of what survived the flood, in terms of knowledge and lineage, and how it has been transmitted to the present day. The 5th tablet's description of knowledge encoded in hereditary lineages, in the oral traditions of specific families selected for this purpose, points to a practice that is documented across cultures that had no apparent contact with each other. The idea of a secret lineage, a keeper family, a hidden tradition maintaining knowledge across generations, appears in virtually every major civilization. In Judaism, the concept of the Levi priestly lineage descended directly from Moses' brother Aaron, which maintained specific ritual knowledge across generations, reflects this pattern. The Kohens, the priestly class within Judaism, maintain to this day the oral tradition that they are descendants of Aaron, the brother of Moses, which puts their lineage in the window of historical time that intersects with the period the tablets describe. In the Vedic tradition of ancient India, the Brahmin caste is explicitly a hereditary knowledge-keeping lineage. The transmission of the Vedas was originally oral, maintained with extraordinary precision across generations, through mnemonic techniques that preserved not just the words, but the specific pronunciation and intonation. The Vedic oral tradition is considered the most precisely preserved oral transmission in human history, maintaining texts verbatim across potentially thousands of years. This level of preservation precision does not arise spontaneously. It is a deliberately designed system, maintained by a community with strong institutional motivation to preserve a specific body of knowledge exactly as it was received. In Polynesia, the navigator priests of the Old Pacific, the individuals who possessed the astronomical and oceanic knowledge that enabled the extraordinary migrations across the Pacific Ocean, were members of hereditary lineages. The knowledge of how to navigate by stars and waves and birds was not public. It was maintained within specific families and transmitted under conditions of deliberate ritual control. In Egypt, the priesthood of the various temples maintained bodies of esoteric knowledge that were transmitted within the institution under strict hierarchical control. The higher initiatory levels of the Egyptian priesthood, according to the accounts of classical writers who described what they witnessed at Egyptian temples, possessed knowledge that was never written down and never shared with the uninitiated. What that knowledge was, specifically, is not known, because the secrecy worked. In the European tradition, the Hermetic and alchemical traditions of the medieval period claimed explicitly to be transmitting knowledge that came from ancient Egypt, which received it from even earlier sources. The Hermetic corpus, the body of texts attributed to the legendary figure Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes the Thrice Great, describes a body of knowledge about the nature of reality, the human soul, and the relationship between the microcosm and the macrocosm that its transmitters claimed was not invented by Greeks or Egyptians, but was received from an earlier, more ancient tradition. The texts themselves are dated to the early centuries CE. But the tradition they claim to transmit claims much greater antiquity. The tradition of Freemasonry, which emerged publicly in the early 18th century but claims historical connections to the builders of Solomon's Temple and, in some of its higher degree traditions, to even more ancient builders, maintains specific ritual knowledge within a hierarchical system of initiation. The specific knowledge transmitted in Freemasonry's higher degrees, beyond the publicly known first 3 degrees, is a matter of some debate, because the members who receive it are sworn to maintain its secrecy. What is known from the lower degrees, which have been extensively documented, is that the tradition is heavily focused on architectural symbolism, on the symbolism of the tools and skills of the builders of great structures, and on a historical narrative, in which the true knowledge of construction, and by extension the true knowledge of the universe, was once possessed and then lost, and is being slowly recovered. The fifth tablet described a system of knowledge transmission through hereditary lineages. The world is full of hereditary lineages that have maintained specific bodies of knowledge across long periods of time. The connection between the tablet's description and these existing traditions is not proof of the tablet's account, but it is a structural consistency that does not go away when you look for it. The question that follows is uncomfortable but necessary. If these lineages are the carriers of transmitted ancient knowledge, as the fifth tablet described, who holds that knowledge today? In what institutions, in what families, in what traditions does it reside? And does that knowledge include the true account of human origins that the 9 tablets reported? Some researchers in this space argue that the answer is yes. That the institutions that maintain the longest unbroken transmission traditions, from the oldest priestly lineages to the modern institutions that claim descent from them, possess a version of the truth about human origins that they have deliberately withheld from the general population. Not because they are evil necessarily, but because the management system described in the 6th tablet's account of the Great Withdrawal is still functioning. The indirect management through bloodlines and religious systems that the Great Ones established before departing is still the operating system of human civilization. And the individuals who understand this are the ones who maintain the system. If this is true, then the suppression of the 9 tablets was not an institutional accident or a bureaucratic failure. It was a feature of a management system operating exactly as designed. Suppress the transmission that would tell humanity who it actually is. Maintain the story that keeps the population manageable. Continue the program until the threshold is reached, and the question of whether to maintain the management system becomes, in practical terms, moot. The 9th tablet, if it said what the accounts claim it said, knew this would happen, and chose to encode the message anyway. The 8th tablet's description of a protocol, a threshold event that would trigger the return of the observers who withdrew from Earth, is perhaps the most practically significant of all the tablet's contents. Because if the protocol was real, and if the threshold was the development of technologies for global communication and artificial intelligence, then by every measure available, the threshold has been crossed. We broadcast radio waves into space beginning in the early 20th century. Our electromagnetic signature has been detectable by any civilization within approximately 100 light-years for a century now. The development of television, radar, and eventually satellite communications expanded that signature significantly. Any sufficiently advanced civilization within our electromagnetic horizon would have had decades to notice us and to begin the response described in the 8th tablet. What would a response look like? This is a question that serious researchers, both in the SETI community and in independent investigation of the phenomenon formerly known as unidentified aerial phenomena, have been wrestling with. The UAP question has in recent years moved from the margins of public discourse to the center of it, in ways that would have been impossible to predict 20 years ago. In 2017, the New York Times published a front-page story on a classified Pentagon program to investigate UAP, revealing video footage of aerial phenomena that exhibited flight characteristics impossible with known human technology. The videos, taken by U.S. Navy pilots using advanced electro-optical systems, showed objects performing maneuvers at speeds and with directional changes that would have killed a human pilot through G-force alone. The objects did not show visible means of propulsion. They did not behave like any aircraft in any known aviation program. In the years following that publication, the U.S. government's engagement with the UAP issue expanded dramatically. Congressional hearings, a dedicated office within the Pentagon, formal acknowledgement by government officials of the existence of craft and phenomena that cannot be explained by known human technology. Former military and intelligence officials speaking publicly, under oath, about encounters and programs that had been classified for decades. The pace of disclosure, which accelerated through 2022, 2023, and 2024, was unlike anything in the previous history of the modern UAP phenomenon. The 8th tablet described observers, beings who withdrew from direct engagement with Earth but positioned themselves to monitor the planet's development. Beings for whom the threshold of detectable technological civilization would trigger a response under a pre-established protocol. The UAP phenomenon, whatever its ultimate explanation, involves objects that are not human in origin, that appear to have been present in Earth's airspace for a significant period, and that have accelerated in frequency of observed encounters in the modern era. The acceleration of encounters parallels the acceleration of human technology. It is consistent with what the 8th tablet described, increasing monitoring activity as the subject of monitoring approaches the threshold. This is speculative. The UAP phenomenon has multiple possible explanations, including conventional human technology, atmospheric and perceptual anomalies, and information warfare. The extraterrestrial hypothesis is one of several that serious investigators consider, not the only one. And the 8 tablets description of returning observers is one potential framework for understanding the phenomenon, not a proven explanation. But the convergence of the tablets account with the current state of public knowledge about UAP is a convergence that the 9th tablet appeared to predict would eventually occur. The monitoring would become less covert as the threshold approached. The threshold was described as producing conditions in which permanent suppression of information became effectively impossible. We live in a world where information travels instantaneously across all national borders, where video footage taken anywhere on Earth can reach hundreds of millions of people within hours, where whistleblowers have mechanisms for disclosure that bypass institutional gatekeepers, where the concentration of information into searchable digital form makes patterns visible that were invisible when the same information existed only in paper archives scattered across hundreds of different institutions. The 9th tablet described the suppression of truth becoming harder as the threshold approached. We are watching that prediction unfold in real time in ways that the researchers who first discussed these tablets in the 1980s could not have anticipated. 9 tablets. 9 chapters of a story that humanity has been trying to tell itself, in fragments, across every culture and every tradition, for as long as we have had the capacity to record memory. We were made by someone for a purpose, with specific capabilities and specific limitations, both deliberate. We were managed through a combination of direct presence and indirect systems for a very long time. The direct presence was withdrawn, but not the management and not the watching. We were left with encoded transmissions in our monuments and our myths and our bloodlines, pointing back to the event of our creation and forward to a promised reunion. We crossed a threshold that triggered the protocol. We are in the threshold period now. This is the story that the 9 tablets reportedly told. It is also, in its broadest outline, the story that the accumulated body of ancient mythology, combined with the findings of modern genetics, archaeology, and astronomy, collectively suggests. The suppression of these 9 tablets, if it happened as described, was one instance of a pattern that is as old as the knowledge itself. Every time the transmission has approached the surface, something has pushed it back down. Every time the story has threatened to become public, some mechanism, institutional or political, or simply the inertia of accepted consensus, has obscured it again. But the 9th tablet said that suppression would eventually fail, that the information was too widely distributed, too deeply encoded in too many forms, for any single act of suppression to eliminate it permanently, and that the period when suppression could succeed was ending. The tablets were found in the sands near Eridu, the first city, the city where the Sumerian tradition says kingship descended from heaven, the city that was given to humanity by the gods, the oldest city in the world, the beginning of the written human record. In the beginning of the written human record, humanity recorded what it knew about its own origins. It said, clearly and in detail, that it was created by beings from the heavens, that those beings came down and walked among humans, that those beings were not unified, that some wanted more for humanity than others, that the conflict between them shaped the early history of civilization, that a catastrophe, partly natural and partly deliberate, nearly ended the human project, that the beings withdrew, but not before leaving transmissions that were designed to reach the future, that a reunion was planned, contingent on a threshold being met. These are not metaphors. They are not the symbolic language of a primitive people trying to make sense of natural phenomena they couldn't understand. They are the recorded memories of a civilization that remembered who made them and tried to preserve that memory in the most permanent form available to them. Fired clay, pressed with marks, left in the ground. The clay survived. The marks survived. The institutions that control the interpretation of those marks have not always wanted us to read them clearly. The tablets that were found near Eridu in 1978, if the accounts are accurate, said clearly what the canonical texts hint at, and someone decided that clarity was dangerous. That the full story, told without institutional filter and mythological packaging, would be too disruptive to the systems that have been managing the human population since the Great Withdrawal. Perhaps they were right to be worried. Because if the story is true, the implications are not just historical, they are present tense. They concern who we are right now, in this moment, watching this, wondering what is real and what has been kept from us and why. They concern the cognitive capacities we have been told are our natural ceiling, and that may be a designed floor. They concern the lifespans we have been told are the natural limit, and that may be a designed constraint. They concern the history we have been taught and the fuller history that exists in suppressed tablets and oral traditions and genetic memory. They concern the question of what we are becoming, and whether that becoming is moving us toward the reunion that the ninth tablet described. The tablets were destroyed, but here we are, talking about what was in them. The transmission found a way through. It always does. There's one final thing worth saying about the 9 tablets, and it is not about what was in them, it is about what happened around them. When something is suppressed, the suppression itself is data. The shape of the silence tells you something about the shape of what is being silenced. If the 9 tablets had contained nothing of significance, nobody would have bothered. An unremarkable cuneiform text from a minor excavation site in southern Iraq in 1978, in the middle of the chaos of the late Hussein era, would have been filed, forgotten, and eventually lost in the ordinary entropy of institutional record-keeping. It would not have required active discouragement of publication. It would not have required senior administrators at multiple institutions to request the withdrawal of conference presentations. It would not have required the translation documents to be submitted to governmental authority rather than released to the scholarly community. The effort invested in not publishing these tablets is, in the absence of the tablets themselves, the most significant evidence we have that they contain something worth suppressing. This is a principle that applies throughout the history of forbidden knowledge. The books that were burned in the greatest numbers tell us, by the sheer scale of the burning, what was considered most dangerous to the burning parties. The traditions that were most aggressively suppressed by conquering civilizations tell us what the conquerors considered most threatening to their own legitimacy. The questions that academic institutions most firmly redirect away from heterodox answers tell us where the foundations of the conventional paradigm are most vulnerable. The 9 tablets are gone. What remains is the silence around where they were, and the very deliberate quality of that silence, maintained across decades by institutions with every reason to prefer the public. Not ask what was found in the sands near Eridu in the summer of 1978. The silence is evidence of what exactly each person must determine for themselves. But it is not nothing. And in an investigation of this kind, nothing is never nothing. The questions the tablets raise do not require the tablets to persist. They persist on their own, in the independent evidence of genetics and archaeology and astronomy and mythology. They persist in the Atrahasis epic and the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Vedic hymns and the Book of Enoch and the Popol Vuh of the Maya and the Dreamtime stories of the Aboriginal Australians and the Zulu tradition of the Anunnaki that Credo Mutwa documented before his death. They persist in the Denisovan DNA that modern humans carry and cannot fully explain. They persist in the chromosome 2 fusion and the mitochondrial bottleneck and the FOXP2 mutation and the metabolically inexplicable size of the human brain. The tablets were 9 voices saying one thing loudly and clearly. The tablets are gone. But 10,000 other voices are saying the same thing, quietly, from the edges of 100 different fields of knowledge, waiting for enough people to listen at the same time for the signal to resolve out of the noise. That time may be closer than it seems. The sands near Eridu are still there. Whatever else was buried in them, whatever else the oldest city on Earth holds in the ground beneath it, has not gone anywhere. The Earth is patient. The clay is patient. The marks pressed into the clay by hands that understood something we have been trying to remember ever since are patient. In the time after, the 9th tablet said, "Those who find these words will know, because the created ones carry in their making the knowledge of what made them. You were not created to be small. The smallness was a beginning. This is what the tablets said before they were taken from us. And this is what we are, still, in the long and complicated process of becoming. The silence is not the end. It never was. What is being suppressed today is being archived tomorrow. What is classified in one decade becomes a congressional hearing in the next. The arc of information is long, but it bends toward disclosure. The 9 tablets understood this, or whoever authored them understood it. The transmission was always meant to outlast the suppressors. Clay outlasts empires. Story outlasts silence. And the questions that humanity carries in its genetic memory, the persistent intuition that there is more to the story of our origins than we have been officially told, those questions do not expire. They compound. They accumulate. They grow louder with every anomaly that the official narrative cannot accommodate, with every site that pushes the timeline back another 1,000 years, with every genetic finding that refuses to fit the standard model of human evolution, with every aerial phenomenon that the most advanced militaries on Earth quietly acknowledge they cannot identify or explain. The 9 tablets from Eridu are gone. The story they told is not.